Pattern Shift presents Rites of the Renouncer, an audiobook serial podcast by Benjamin Kamphaus. Prologue. I sat in a dimly lit room typing. Each key let out a soft tap, a spring pushing it back into the finger after each depression, then a catch and low click from the wall, as a hum I had lost awareness of stopped and restarted with a different character. A change in airflow and its harmonic content. Some shift in temperature, humidity, or balance between gases had triggered it. My prolonged presence in the room had likely disturbed the previous equilibrium. I found my breathing pattern had grown shallow. My eyes were having trouble focusing, and I felt a slight burn from the tiny muscles around the eyelids, strain from having kept them directed at the screen for several hours. Pain and stiffness on the right side of my neck threatened to spread up further into my head. I took a deeper inhale and exhale, risking some loss of alertness for the relief of bringing in more oxygen. My fingers continued their typing, the words flowing from them into the computer systems without always traveling through my awareness. There was a symmetry of needs finding each other in the steadiness of that act. What I was carrying would not fit inside me. I could not bear to contain it, and others had to know. The obligation to preserve this for them pulled as the obligation to release it from within me pushed in rhythm, the ebb and flow of my task. As I grew tired, the small screen before me seemed to flicker. I knew it must be a trick of the eyes, as the refresh rate was too high for me to genuinely detect any disturbance. Behind my flow of words, errors were being corrected and mistakes smoothed automatically. The intensity of that subtle dance was increasing. At first, it had only been an occasional shift of a letter here or there in my peripheral vision. Now it seemed as though more words were disturbed than left as they were. So much accomplished, so much still to do. I stopped for a moment, knowing the contents were being flushed to redundant storage with each pause at the keystrokes. Whatever I could leave here, that work would all be preserved. I skimmed through what I had written, seeing what yet might be missing. At last, I was finished. I tapped out my final directive, letting the machines know it was ready to be distributed. Then I let my weight slump down into the chair, reflecting on all that had taken place. Chapter 1. To whomever may receive this transmission, I am Viktor Goto of the Vaskania system. Herein I have sought to provide an account of how I, who had left the home of my birth for Oneiri Station 3 decades before, traveled once again to the world of Vaskania Prime, to return the untethered dreamer Owen who was my childhood friend, to his physical body. I expect that what took place there will be of interest to you. We in the Vaskania system are but one human community, the product of one machine enterprise among many such efforts. What I found in the dream world has implications for all of us. To that end, I have recorded my experience and seen to its broadcast to Sol and all other star systems to which fleets like our own were dispatched so many years ago. There is nothing mentioned in the archives from Earth like Vaskania Prime's dream world. It is the place to which I and every other human in this system finds themselves transported when we are asleep. When asleep, we should, by the expectations of all reference material I can find, be subjected to a different sort of dreaming, a series of thoughts, images, and sensations of our brain's own making. I have never had such an experience. Instead, it is as if I am transported to another realm. By its nature, the dream world is not externally measurable, and our own machines have never done more than record my own testimony and that of the others here concerning our time in it. You may venture that this dream world is a hallucination, an understandable impulse. We have learned over many sleep cycles that our experiences in this other world align, and that when we combine our observations into one, a cohesive picture emerges. As we enter and exit the dream world through waking and sleeping, its contents endure, although they differ in substance from the contents of the physical reality to which you are likely more accustomed. The experience on which I report now, however, was mine alone. No others accompanied me or share any memories of the place I found on this journey into the dream world, and no others witnessed what I encountered there just before my return. Solitary and fallible human observer that I am, this account is all I have, and so I offer it to all worlds. I have described my time leading up to my fateful entry into the dream world, and included what I can of my own personal history and training. I believe it necessary to understand, as much as you may be able, the full context of who I am. To know the humble instrument that now serves as the conduit of your observation, my perception, the replay of my recollection, the distillation of what remains into this account. Just as one calibrates an instrument in order to measure with it, I provide for you the state of my own mind leading up to and at that critical moment. Its contents are the only measurements I have. The year is 124 in our reckoning. Year 0 marks the birth of our first embryo, though this child was not ultimately viable. The machines have been active in our system much longer before that. We record time in Earth measurements. By year, I mean the duration of 1 year on Earth. This does not match those few months it takes Vaskania Prime to orbit its sun, but it corresponds still to some instinctive tempo all humans possess, entrained from having evolved on Earth and the Sol system. We do the same for other measures of time as well. Living in the habitable band of this tidally locked planet, there's little point to devising our own units to subdivide and demarcate day and night. You might say Earthbound timekeeping is instinctive as well for the machines, whose record-keeping was exhaustively worked out in such units. The mapping from any time system to Unix time and its corresponding Earth system calendar has now been distributed to many worlds beyond Sol. Epoch milliseconds have superseded the use of Anno Domini or other earlier Earth calendar datums, at least as relativity allows, historical accident that this may be. The machines have affixed the corresponding epoch time to this transmission, along with information necessary for working out the conversions from our fleet's world line to several models of Earth time, so that all who receive this transmission can determine when these events occurred. It is my hope that this is sufficient context for other human observers, in whichever system you may now dwell, to understand all that comes next. When further information is required, I will provide it within the body of this account. I have only a small amount of time to set things down, so I begin with my arrival on the surface of Vaskania Prime. The lander was inadequately named. For the purposes of risk mitigation and efficiency, it made more sense for the craft to avoid direct landings on the surface, never dipping further into the atmosphere than it had to, especially when the craft's payload was so small, one human being, namely me. This cargo could see to its own landing, letting the craft return to space from the upper atmosphere without wasting the machine's reserves of hydrocarbons on the fuel required for exit. Swoop would be a more fitting name, I thought to myself as I readied for that human-scale landing. A hatch opened at the appointed time, and a buzzer sounded in my ears. I fell backwards automatically, departing through the hatch as if entering a pool of water, easing into freefall with the practiced flow of many simulated landings. Well-conditioned threads in my mind were clamping down on fear, restructuring it into heightened watchfulness and clarity of movement, dispensing with the second-guessing and escape planning that would no longer be of use. As I descended through the atmosphere, parts of the vac suit stiffened and flexed for several seconds, orienting me into the planned trajectory. Then, as the ground neared, an enormous parachute opened above. Its size would counter the low air resistance on Vaskania Prime, my world. I corrected myself, allowing for belonging, if still avoiding any sense of ownership. I could renounce aspects of my present, but not my history. The past sticks to you. I seemed to drift for a small lifetime then, a subjective passing of time that I knew would extend beyond what any clock would verify. Whatever time remained, those tens of seconds, I would be unneeded for it. The vac suit knew best how to direct my descent, its automated adjustments serving me better than any unnatural motion I could have trained my primate body to produce. I was happy to defer to the machines and their expertise in such things for this leg of my journey, accepting their parameters for risk tolerance and criteria for success. All things considered, I touched down on the surface quite gently. Darklight City was roughly an hour away by foot. 5.4 kilometers, according to a readout on the vac suit's visor. I knew I had only to signal and a vehicle would be out to collect me, but there was no danger or hurry. The vac suit would maintain a breathable mixture of gases for many more hours, and Vaskania Prime's atmosphere could support brief suitless excursions, something that had not been true during my childhood. After days of cramped travel from my remote orbit, my home in Oneiri Station, I welcomed the exercise and freedom of movement, and I appreciated the time to think. After these 30 years away, I still wanted more time to think. My approach to Darklight City was uneventful. Networks of power grids and solar arrays dotted the landscape. It was a stark emptiness, a contrast to the satellite images and videos of Earth's past I've studied. One looks at those and sees the messiness of life in every direction. Grasslands and forests, oceans and waterways, all teeming with color and movement. A system of mutual antagonism and support between the organisms, encompassing so much of Earth's matter in the exchange, from whales down to microbes. So much scaffolding for the web of interactions through which life flows and finds its way. On Vaskania Prime and throughout our system, the first colonizers are always machine. These solar arrays and power grids, along with antennas, relay points, way stations, cargo transports, warehouses, are the ecosystem of machinery. Energy is collected, stored, accessed, raw materials are obtained, transported, organized, the flow of calories and lifeblood for a different kind of animal. Here, the tiny progress of green and brown and blue is dwarfed in comparison to this metallic industry. The city was built on the same image. Signs of life inside were swallowed up by its energy grid, material storage, and yet unused structures. It was like a child swimming inside an adult's clothing. The whole layout spoke to a potential that ran well ahead of its current human population, not to mention the many areas of the city not intended for human beings to ever live in. Cooperative and codependent as we were, the machines had their domains and we had ours. There was overlap, but it was limited. I was getting closer now. Does an animal feel something if it comes back to its den after such a long time away? What if the insides are rearranged, the smells disturbed or hidden behind others? Or if the den and all its supporting ground is scooped out, displaced by other land or structures? Would it still know that this was a place where it sought warmth and slept safely through so many nights? The knowledge that I was returning, those words and their meaning, the anticipation they implied, this all stood between me and any such raw animal understanding of a home. I could not feel my way towards any authenticity of experience without losing the ability to tell if I was discovering or just inventing it. I could blank my mind of concrete expectations, cultivate openness and gratitude towards what might come my way. But I could not then or now free myself of that medium of language, the sounds and symbols that possess me and act through me, simulating some other reality which then colors my awareness of all things. As I walked, the city ceased to be a region of my vision and began to engulf it. There was no wall or boundary that marked its beginning, nothing to be kept wholly out of it or wholly inside it. The power lines and information infrastructure increased in density, the needs and uses these fulfilled also increasing as I went along. The vac suit began receiving a signal then, and I saw a small quadcopter drone headed my way. Viktor Goto displayed the readout in the vac suit's visor. I am here to guide you to the inhabited quarter of Darklight City. The inner city was coated in plastic. By inner city, I mean the lived-in portion, the smaller part, not the husks of larger buildings still lacking flesh, intended no doubt for future use by humans or machines. It gave the city an odd, undisturbed look. The plastic suggested sterility rather than the presence of life I knew was its true meaning. I had followed the drone's lead to a section of the plastic coating where a glass tunnel marked the entrance from the outer atmosphere to the inside, where air was curated for shared circulation between humans and plants. Small patches of green were visible just inside the plastic as I entered the tunnel, one door sliding down behind me to seal off the outside as the airlock cycled and the inward door opened. I removed my helmet almost immediately, having grown a bit weary from its weight on my head. There are recombobulation facilities nearby. A voice lacking natural cadence spoke out from the drone. I nodded, not noticing anyone else around me yet. The drone led me to a small building that contained bathrooms and a few closets filled with clothing of various sizes. There I removed my vac suit, saw to my biological needs, and took a quick shower. I put on one of the more nondescript outfits, then remembered my earpiece. I fished it out from a pocket in my discarded vac suit and placed it in my ear. After that, I left the building, taking in more of the city's sights and sounds, my perception no longer mediated by the vac suit. I walked into that alien landscape of a human city, wholly unlike my habitat on Oneiri Station. There I had tended a garden, eventually providing for the majority of my own subsistence. I kept no animals and relied on supplements to accommodate the limited range of soils and synthetic substrates the machines have been able to construct for me. Tuning the soil biome to get it remotely nutritive for the plant, much less the human, had been quite a project. When I first arrived in my late teenage years, the station had been only a small shelter from vacuum, not unlike early space stations in Earth's time. The machine slowly expanded it to my specifications, eventually building it out into what the archives describe as an O'Neill cylinder. The expense as we measure it, in raw material from the asteroid belts in the outer system, had been more than that needed by the nascent colony. The expenditure in time, fuel, and risk, however, was preferable to the same volume of material being taken to and occasionally from the surface of a planet, at least as far as the machines measured such things. My experiment living away was also their experiment with other modes of life for the humans in their care. They found the station's environment much more pliable, with a smaller volume of atmosphere, soil, water, and the like with which to cultivate small ecosystems. No doubt the machines updated their models with some preference for synthetic habitats and orbits over the messiness of planets. With their long-running, patient chatter across the light years, you may be living in one now as you read this, your own machines having learned from the findings of my experiment or similar ones conducted in other systems. I was now in the inhabited quarter. I did not see people out and about, but there were lights shining from windows. The city was near the darkness of the habitable band on Vaskania Prime, the occasional excesses of cold being easier to handle than occasional excesses of heat in the early colonies, leading to a sense of perpetual dusk or dawn. The buildings were connected only by the worn, gravelly trails of walkways. The city was small enough that there was only foot traffic. The machines had built small vehicles suited for the rough, rocky terrain, but they were not necessary for anything other than overland excursions. Such excursions and vehicles were seldom useful for more than satisfying some human curiosity or urge anyways. Mineral prospection or geological exploration could be done as effectively from the atmosphere or orbit, the mixture of spectral imaging and radar technologies revealing the majority of the secrets of the planet's crust. As I turned a corner, I nearly ran into a young boy, his head down as he walked quickly and purposefully. He was probably no more than 10. We both stopped. "Excuse," I started to say, my first word on the surface. "You've come here unarmed," the boy interrupted, eyed me curiously, then produced a small charm. "You might want this." The charm was a smooth stone, a dark circle marked a pupil in its center, outer rings in light and dark blue forming the rest of an eye. "Thanks," I said, not sure what to make of it. He turned and started off, rounding the corner from which I'd just come without waiting for an additional response. The machine voice came into my ear like the buzzing of an insect. The locals have developed some odd traditions in your absence. Its attempt at mimicking sarcasm fell flat. It began to rattle off some facts about the evil eye charm, its history, how it came to be used here. After the first sentence or two, I tuned most of it out. In the beginner's mind. It occurred to me that I didn't know if the boy had been born naturally from a human mother or from the machine's incubation technology. The more recent generations could reproduce naturally and expect as good of an outcome as human beings ever could, playing that great lottery of parenthood. There were no restrictions on it, though the most careful would still defer, I was nearly sure, to the genetic engineering technologies possessed by the machines, and now, after many years, a few of our own kind. I walked a short way from there to my first destination. The sign blazed neon, Unruh in Part bar, part coffee house, the lifeblood of any city. I was awake now, and knew I would need to remain so for these next few hours. The state I needed to be in for my work required a just-so level of sleep deprivation, augmented by chemical aid. To that end, I entered the young city's lone drinking establishment for insomniacs. Viktor Goto, the woman who was tending bar, said, looking half at me, half past me, as if missing my measure. Disappointment, puzzlement in the voice. The machines had disseminated news of my arrival, but I couldn't imagine I was like any idea someone on the surface might have of me. Yes, I started, somewhat unsure. It had been 30 years since I'd had a face-to-face conversation with another human being. To those on the surface, I'd been as gone as the dead. What do ghosts say when they come back to walk around with the living? You probably saw things change since you left. An understatement. Small talk that it was, I appreciated the attempt. The bartender knew how to talk to ghosts about as well as this ghost knew how to talk with her, I decided. Whiskey, I said, looking at the selection behind the bartender, delighted to see those letters spelled out on one of the labels. She gave me a curious glance at that. Whiskey. For the monk? Of course. I'm a dutiful child to my ancestors. What are we as human beings if not the vector by which fermentable grains transmit themselves through the galaxy? You've developed quite a worldview in your time off-world, Renouncer. I chuckled a bit. Maybe humor and insight go hand in hand? I couldn't say. But there is something to our moral progress as a species and the amount of time we can wait to consume or peddle our liquor. An oak tree takes decades to reach maturity, the better whiskey usually a similar amount to age. Some of the best, at least as I've read in the archives, from a second use of a cask or multiple casks. And all that time here, directed to those ends on a new planet. Given our base lifespan, it's quite a testament to long-term planning, cooperation, thoughts of others, and so on. Ah, the monk shows himself. Do you think it tastes right? She waited, clearly amused. I sipped. The bitter sharpness of the alcohol, a touch of the vanillin I knew had been imbued by the barrel aging. A subtle character of toffee imparted by the once burnt oil in the barley. Not sure how I'd know. Anyways, I'm only sipping. Alcohol flush. I shrugged. A raised eyebrow was my response. What about the downsides? A man asked a few seats to the right down the bar from me. He had overheard, possibly recognized me before. He certainly realized who I was now. You mean to the whiskey? Yes. Of course there are downsides. The risk tracks our own failings, as with many other things. As children age, we lock fewer items away out of reach. Does overthinking it enhance or take away from the taste? The bartender prodded, grinning. I returned the grin. You may have picked up more wisdom here than I could have hoped to through solitude. I took a few more sips of the whiskey in quiet. A few others relaxed in the bar as well. 2 women off to my side were playing a game set on the table, shogi from the looks of it. One was either blaming or congratulating the other for the mess she was in now. It was difficult to discern which. Near as I could tell, neither had so much as glanced up as I entered or spoke to the bartender. Honestly, sitting there on the day of my return, preoccupied with my thoughts, still not even sure what weight to place on the regard of others, I was more grateful than I can say at having had someone not care to notice me. After the whiskey, I ordered a small coffee. A man came from the kitchen area and back to prepare it, pushing water through grounds and a filter with a small hand press. I say coffee, though perhaps I should specify, for clarity, that it was a coffee-like concoction with synthetic caffeine, the ground a blend from what plants we could manage. The coffea plants of Earth were not yet among their number. I was the only one ordering coffee at this hour. For the others here, this place was a nightcap, a final settling of the day. The bar's interior, the drinks, the company, they were a mix of environmental cues and medicine, a key that fit inside them and turned, letting them acknowledge the days passing, to wander back into their quarters, the small apartments under the plastic that sheathed Dark Light City's curated atmosphere, and finally give in to sleep. For me on this night, however, it was a staging ground. I was regrouping for my landing and mustering my inner forces for the work I knew was ahead. Chapter 2. From my readings in the archives, I know we failed to achieve the great technological feats our ancestors had hoped for. Our space travel, in particular, had suffered. We were not able to accelerate to even within a tenth of the speed of light. We had no sleeper pods, could not freeze and unfreeze living human beings. Only modest extensions of our lifespan had been made through gene fixing, and longer life would have been necessary, I imagine, for such capabilities to have been made possible. Since we could not leave one system and arrive at another still alive and intact, what use could the machines possibly have for us in those great distances between stars? They had no need of our assistance in either their long-term planning or their day-to-day operations, and so we had no generation ships. The machines had many limits as intelligent agents, but there is no comparison to be made between our capabilities and theirs when it comes to navigating between stars, preventing collisions, and so on. They outdo us in the avoidance of almost every kind of error, being well suited to the deterministic execution of the activities for which they were engineered: resource gathering, navigation and spaceflight, the construction of anything needed from those materials found commonly in orbit around stars, and ultimately the built environment in which we, the humans in their care, would be born and live our lives. By the time of my birth, we had all come to the Vaskania Prime system as embryos and been incubated there, born out of the fluid sac apparatus the machines used to simulate a womb. To this end, the hospital and its early modest grounds, with its robotic caretakers, these were all the first structures built on the surface with humans in mind. By my generation, there were a few adults to look after and care for the young, but this had not been true for the first several. Those initial attempts at raising human beings had not been successful, the children in question dying early in their childhoods. The hospital at this time was a single-domed shelter with its own protective atmosphere. Without viable humans, this was all that was needed. The next few generations made it further, though eventually succumbing to various cancers or dementias before reaching the age I am now. Importantly, though, the last of those generations had been long-lived enough to be there for the following generation of children, who were then raised with human adults present for the first time in our history. That first generation of children who grew up with the assistance of their elders was the elder generation that was there for me. It had all been a necessary sacrifice to create this colony. Perhaps not necessary, you could argue. Nonetheless, it was the sacrifice we made, the only way we and the machines had found to make a start. The hospital expanded, and the city grew up in proportion to it. As an Earth city would grow at a scale to match the size of its warehouses, the productivity of its fields, the local transportation network, and so on, Darklight City's primary business was the production and maintenance of human beings, and so it grew accordingly. I spoke earlier of how we failed to achieve technological visions for spaceflight. The same was true of genetic engineering. The machines and we in turn had the power to make modifications, but it was not just a matter of separating the good from the bad and eliminating the bad. True, we could identify and prevent many harmful mutations. This was trivial before the machines left the solar system. For our environment, certain variants were always preferred over others. Beyond this, every interesting polymorphism was a double-edged sword. All adjustments seemed to reach across the genome and interact with one another. And that messiest of sciences, the further interaction with environmental conditions that led to phenotypic differences, was omnipresent. That latter condition was the great experiment in which we all partook, and so the hospital's role continued to be that of the central business district of this enterprise. In any set of experiments sufficiently complicated so as to be interesting, unforeseen circumstances emerge. For us, it was the dream world. Imagine the confusion of the machines. Unable to experience that place directly, equipped only with models of healthy sleep in physiological terms. This simple biological basis for dreaming was the only concept of it that fell in their purview. In the archives, they could only access an awkward mix of technical accounts of dreaming and self-reports of human dreamers throughout history, with little to nothing of the raw dreams surviving the act of waking and gap-filling confabulation. The machines had comprehensive diagnostics to apply to each human in their care, as matched their gardener's intent, growing us like plants in a greenhouse. Then, as we grew older for the first time, they expanded the scope of their child-rearing activities to something like animal husbandry. How does monitoring dreaming even factor into this labor? How would you, an undreaming machine, guess that you should be tracking the subjective contents as reported on waking, to suspect that they would differ categorically, and if so, that it could matter? And then we, on waking. We had experienced and accepted the dream world as it was. Only later, as we aged, did we have trouble comparing our own dreaming experience to that of those half-reports in so many eras of accounts, real or fiction, from the archives. What could we, or they, make of it? Eventually, as we found ourselves returning to some of the same places, we spoke to one another, began to correlate our own experiences in dreaming, realized we had come near each other when seeing distant figures. The dream world began to emerge not as an odd, identical experience or the artifice of each individual mind, but as a cohesive and shared reality. The machines were able to help us assemble these fragments, but the direct experience was wholly closed off to them. Whatever net our dreaming selves wandered into, whatever information in our brains interfaced involuntarily with that place, they knew of no software by which to access it. I had left the bar half an hour earlier and walked on my own toward the hospital. This was the closest thing I had to a homecoming, the only part of the city I had lived in, changed though it was. The changes were sufficient to rob the place of familiarity, to leave me as a tourist just passing through the land of my birth. I listened to the swoosh and burble of the great river get louder as I approached the half-familiar buildings at its shore. In the hospital, the bodies of the untethered lingered while their minds were away. Not fully catatonic, some instinctive drive kept the reflexes intact. Eyes glanced here and there in response to sound stimulus. If left to fall, a hand would reach out to catch or steady the body it was attached to. It was as if some spacecraft had been left in standby. All support systems nominal, sensors intact, but no pilot, no course, no one to read the sensor outputs of the logs of various subsystems. A few caretakers were there, some machine, some human. In the Vaskania system, we don't have dedicated professions, at least no sense of a wage or livelihood as in the old times of Earth. In your own system, you may have matched our social structure or differed. With the age of our colony, we defer to the machines for governance, but we are still motivated to be useful, to learn and to know things, and so on. And some people here in the city, out of friendship, obligation, or a sense of appropriateness, made time to help care for the untethered or sit with them. Otherwise, the machines kept to the basic duties of feeding, sanitary disposal, and the like. It was physical maintenance they were concerned with, rather than comfort. As I walked that ward where the untethered were kept, I saw many who had been afflicted. 49, the readout displayed to count helpfully. I had recognized 8 of the faces, a few I had grown up with. The other 41 were born or grew up after my departure. Here in my late 40s, I was an elder among so many afflicted as children, and I possessed a reflexive parental instinct toward them. I wanted to save all of them, but I had to start somewhere. I came at last to where Owen sat, rocking slowly in a chair. He had aged similarly to me, slightly less if my gut impression merited trust. I had been prepared with images the machines had provided, of course, but it was something different to encounter someone in person rather than from a dossier. I felt the breath catch in my upper airway, my mouth suddenly drying out. The image of him I carried inside me was that of my teenage friend, not this empty, aged body. Owen and I were both born in the same generation on Vaskania Prime, in the settlement that one day would become Darklight City. We only had meager quarters then, small children packed in domes that were being expanded into the grounds of the hospital, the further modules that would grow into the city in various stages of construction. Our generation was considered a resounding success and viability by the machines, a sterile way of saying that most of us did not die or degenerate to incoherent rambling by late adolescence. I knew Owen in my youth with the intimacy that early bands of humans must have felt, before there were larger federations of tribes or states. We were all family of a sort, more diverse genetically, of course. The machines saw to that, not directly related. But all the early bonding instincts made us as siblings and neighbors. With limited quarters and means, we had little in the way of privacy or individual property. Almost everything of his was also something of mine. Owen and I gravitated toward one another. He performed some essential social role I could not. If I made a joke or observation, it was underneath my breath, just to myself. He had a natural instinct for repeating the higher quality of these remarks, giving credit or not as the mood struck him. I was of a mind to shrink away from even the kindest of attentions, and was happy to trade much of the credit for him to surface my thoughts to others. Then there was one night that I woke from my dreams and Owen did not. The material conditions were as simple as that. I attempted to shake him awake and his eyes opened. He looked at me, but there was nothing there. Even now, composing this account, I can feel my stomach sink with dread at the memory. He was as the other untethered are now, no crew on his ship. The machines had nothing to offer me. No study I made of humanity's past matched his condition. I could find mentions of similar symptoms from outbreaks of viral encephalitis, disorders of dopamine and other neurotransmitters. None of that applied here. To make sense of what happened, I would have to study the dream world and my experience of it. I did not yet know, but my life course was set from there, my time away and my final return here. If I could have fed my raw experience of the dream world into the machines, would they have predicted the arc of my life? The affliction aside, his body would have been free at least from the anxiety and neuroticism of having its keeper present. I knew I had weathered more exposure to those forces than Owen in that time. Whatever any outside observer would have made of my time on Oneiri Station, it was not peaceful. The time away and my return, for me, every next move had eventually become obvious and necessary. But the future those moves implied was like a vast sheet of one-way glass. It seemed to be peering into me, inspecting me, testing my worthiness, but I could see nothing through it. What is the function of grief? Why would such a thing evolve? Was it a punishment for having failed our friends, this source of great sorrow there, just to coax our species into a slightly lower failure rate? Was it just the misapplication of a regret meant for the exile and the outcast, or perhaps its inverse, a warning to make casting out or killing another only a last resort? The stakes of being together as humans has to be high, if there is any underlying purpose in grief at all. And Owen had left involuntarily, but my exile was by choice. I had made my appeal to the machines a few weeks after he had not woken. When I failed to relent, when they came to believe I was set on such a course, they had granted this wish. I could still hear and feel that shaking force through my entire body as the base of the rocket became a series of explosions, carrying me away from that planet-shaped trap, the land becoming smaller than the limits of my vision, then just a bulging spheroid, empty space and the red sun beyond. When I left, I had no plans of coming back soon or perhaps ever. My thoughts instead turned to figuring out what the point of my existence was or should be at all. What good is a human being? I had considered this question often in my 30 years away. It dominated my thoughts the first few years. It is always intrinsically coupled to that fundamental human problem. Given that I'm alive, what should I do about it? I could be flippant and tell you that to be human only means to experience the universe in a particular way. There's some truth to that, but I find it a bit vacuous. An abuse of language for an observation that loses salience when viewed from any other angle. What use are we to others, then, more directly to the machines? Of course, the machines were imbued by their makers with the desire, above all things, to spread humanity to other star systems. It was what they were for, and they were indisputably designed by our ancestors. There was no place for them to doubt their purpose, but we were not just some passive material for them to spread either. As far as our kind was concerned, the machines engaged most of all in granting us wishes. Machines are, despite the craft of all humanity, dull companions. I became painfully aware of this in my solitude on Oneiri Station. I had machine company, after all, and yet solitude is the right word for what I experienced. I interacted with machines in even more ways than one does another human, by voice, text, direct sensing of my own neural pathways, sensory output, whatever means they could supply or invent. On the other side of machine interaction, though, it's all business and no play. This playfulness says something about the essence of humanity, and the machines focused above all else in creating ways and spaces in which we could play. This project of wish fulfillment provided the machines with a vast creative market. As instinctively as animals play fight with one another, humans toy with possibilities in the world. Exploration and generation, we were still the machines better in this. And who knew what possibilities would become realities, like my own project here, indulged, granted a life of solitude in orbit. And maybe now I was tapped as part of that greater machine and human hybrid, that superorganism, to venture into the dream world where no machine could, and make use of that training I could not have justified, at least in machine terms, when I undertook it. And as I now know, to encounter, as a representative for our kind, part ambassador and part soldier, what I encountered in that place. In my teens, having lost my friend, none of that had crystallized yet. I just knew it felt wrong to carry on as though nothing had happened. The archives and our virtual environments had taught me that same mix of science and Earth history as the other children, this faraway sense of being human. The makers of the machine fleets might have imagined the last few centuries would have been of more interest. Those political and technological developments had ultimately culminated in the project that produced the colony on Vaskania Prime. It was our origin story, after all. But that period was contingency stacked upon contingency, the noise of each historical accident that led to that unification of purpose having masked the full possibilities of humanity. One person here or there, dying or living in this place or that, this country waxing instead of waning and vice versa, and everything comes out differently. The archives possessed thousands upon thousands of imagined worlds. The immediately preceding history and soul was of smaller interest and relevance to us than those imaginings, being itself but one accidentally wrought example of how humans might live. Even then, I was drawn to the most ancient patterns. Human minds across vast gulfs of time and space had engaged with one another, working on the same problems over and over again. They built on others, gained advocates and enemies across millennia, lines of thought vanishing or multiplying. The scientific insights of the past centuries into the physical nature of reality, the brain, the commonalities of information and representation, these all helped shed insight on the ancient problems, but only just so. For the great problem, what do I do next? There is no simple causative principle that emerges from humanity's understandings of the workings of the universe. Like so many before me struggling with this, I had renounced the life of the householder. I cannot say with a straight face that I sought any kind of enlightenment. I had a simple animal urge to bolt, to escape the place where my friend had come to harm, to avoid its contagious power, its infection. It was a selfish, bestial urge to get away that solidified under my own ability to rationalize it into a fortress of determined action. Then I fell asleep for the first time while my shuttlecraft made its way to the small, newly assembled habitable quarters and the relay point at Vaskania Prime Lagrange 5. In that place between homes, I entered the dream world and found both myself and it to be as distant shadows cast from different portals onto the same wall. I had a new purpose then. I did not know where it would take me, did not know the point of being human then or even now, but I knew of a point, one thing I could do, an obvious next step. And so, in taking these steps, we chart out the course of our lives. Ready? A machine voice in the earpiece. The time for revisiting these thoughts had ended. I felt the drowsiness hit me as I sat next to Owen and nodded. A small, wheeled drone entered the room and extended a single appendage with a needle and lens toward me. I presented my right wrist, a fast, unceremonious snap, and the needle entered a vein. Then a bandage was wrapped around me by another arm that must have been extended by the same machine. I was connected to the IV. I sipped from a cup of black tea. This I had come by honestly, experimenting with camellia plants in my garden until the right mix of isolated biome, substrate adjustment, and genetic fiddling had given me access at last to one naturally occurring form of caffeine. That time-tested central nervous stimulant and its corresponding spikes in adrenaline and cortisol secretions after consumption. The human mind was like a stringed instrument. It needed a certain level of tension to function ideally. Too little, and it flapped around uselessly, failing to produce any audible tone. Too much, and it would snap when played. I joined those before me who had used tea to tune their concentration carefully to match the work at hand. I felt a hyper-awareness of my body, and its configuration began to spread over me. Something was out of place. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the evil eye charm. The Nazar, as the machine had informed me in its rambling, that the child had handed to me on my entrance to the city. The abstract eye on the surface seemed somehow aimed at me without looking. There were several similarly colored beads strung along a bit of cloth leading back from the eye. The blues, whites, and blacks turned just out of alignment with one another. I worked my fingers around the beads, feeling a compulsion to tweak their arrangement. The rings around the eye seemed to shift in my peripheral vision as my focus moved away, my eyes failing to accurately track the roughly demarcated boundaries of the blue rings as my pupils shifted and dilated in reaction to the chemicals entering my bloodstream through the IV. I held Owen's hand, sitting in that ward, the chemical cocktail the machines and I had prepared sweeping through my body, beginning to soften my perception. My visual input faded slowly as a sense of otherworldly calm took hold. I felt the steady beat of Owen's pulse from my grip on his hand. Now, already scarcely remembered, the high frequencies of beeping around me sucked down to a lower range, then washed out into a steady, uncolored tone, then pure physical sensation. That pulse would lead me, at least I hoped, to him, or some other input from my real-world perception or that of the machines monitoring him, feeding me raw signal. I hoped one of those would provide me a means by which to find and anchor him. Those thoughts and plans were already dissipating from my awareness, though. The unconscious parts of me would have to see to them. I closed my eyes, feeling that half-sleep take me. Chapter 3. The caverns were deep, catacombing the interior of the mountains to seemingly unfathomable extents. Pockets of ice must have formed in the world's ancient past, then melted later as the mountains above were lifted, leaving hollow structures of semi-supported stone throughout. Some had already collapsed. Who could say when the currently intact ones might also? The weight of the stone that made up the mountains had to be enormous. Here and there were scattered small pools of water. The only creatures about were insects, too tiny for me to make out any significant features, and a few tadpoles. They struck me as tadpoles, at least, with small four-appendages that looked only partially formed. They could also have simply evolved for life in the caverns, needing only to crawl short distances from one pool to the next, or to get themselves back into the water if suddenly swept out. I certainly hadn't seen anything I could call the adult stage of that species. I had been lost in these caves for what must have been weeks. My supplies were limited. I had a few dense bar-like rations I kept with me for, well, cases like this. I had drunk all the water I had taken with me some time ago and had been living off what I could treat with my personal filtration device. The pools scattered in the cave seemed stagnant, though still clear enough that it suggested some periodic recirculation of the waters. Perhaps steam came up through vents, or rainwater drained down from the surface, occasionally disturbing and redistributing these pools from their current pockets, and eroding new channels through which the water could flow. With the ample supply of water in the pools, the filtration system was my bottleneck. The water needed enough sterilization before drinking, that getting an adequate amount through was quite a chore, and I seemed to always be thirsty. Being surrounded by the riches of undrinkable water in the cave and limited to the throughput of my filter only made that thirst less bearable. My food would run out regardless in only a few days. I needed some plan to... only a few days. I stopped. Days? Had I slept in the cave? Did that sleep thrust me into the dream world as I knew it must? Was it the full strength of that shared hallucination? Or something fainter? The playground in which I had begun to perfect my dreamcraft on Oneiri Station. How had I come to be in the caves in the first place? What had I set out to do? Pieces of my mind cohered, tendrils reaching through gaps in my memory like plant roots working through cracks in ancient stone. The scene in which I found myself began to change. Not its contents, I was still in those caverns, but their significance, my reckoning, they had all shifted. The familiarity, the hint from which my mind had confabulated the weeks, it all began to dissipate. I had not been here weeks, possibly only an hour, maybe a few minutes. I had lost myself temporarily, entering the dream world from Vaskania Prime's surface where it was so strong. But I had recovered. I was through the first step. I was Viktor Goto, the renouncer of Oneiri Station. I had come back to my home world to enter the dream world there intentionally, and I had work to do. First, though, to get out of these caves. My escape, such that it was, had filled me with a sense of cautious optimism. The task ahead was not any easier, but it now felt manageable. Navigating out of the caves simply took time and discipline. Every guess about the direction of a trace of outside wind had to be tested, then correlated with the positions of the pools of water and the smells the wind carried. I stacked rocks as I progressed, careful not to repeat any links in the path I plotted through the caves. Soon, fragments of light began to appear, and the guesswork was mostly done. My form changed as I moved throughout. When I encountered small passages, I would find I was smaller as well. Difficult ascents appeared before me here and there, but the tendons in my hands and forearms strengthened in time to meet the challenge. This was the work of my unconscious, reshaping me as I went. I would find items or traits I needed to possess to meet obstacles as I came across them. I worked my way upward, stepping and scrambling, until the light overtook the cave walls and the space of my vision. I was out in the open air. I should say something about the dream world and my training for it here. In the archives of Earth, there are texts that deal with the subject of lucid dreaming. And though this may be an acceptable starting point, my practice differed from it significantly. In lucid dreaming, the intent is to become awake, to make yourself aware of the dream state so that your conscious mind can take over and transport you to new places, using dreaming as a palette for everything from spiritual training to wish fulfillment. But Vaskania Prime's dream world differs from normal human dreaming. We are not free to form whatever small partial universe our brain conjures, but instead we are bound to fixed circumstances, at least to an extent. We can exercise some limited control of our own projections into that dream world, but much of that projection is not consciously determined. The portion that is conscious is limited by slots of working memory and the reality of sequential processing. The lion's share of raw thinking power is in the unconscious. And so the unconscious must be harnessed and brought to bear on the problems at hand in the dream world, just as it handles our perception and movement in the waking world. The dream world's interface, as we might term it, is a humble one, a small sphere of perceptual reality and intentionality any conscious being can bring with them and shape. I needed everything I could muster to have any hope of navigating intentionally, to keep my movement free and my orientation clear. To deal with confrontations, I needed as much mastery over my unconscious self and its processes as possible. Mastery, a silly word for it, to be quite honest. Once one has undergone that training, as I did for those 30 years on Oneiri Station, it is as much about releasing control as gaining it. What did I do all that time? The simplest way I could describe it is to say that I meditated. But this was as unlike meditation on Earth as a bird's flight is unlike a spacecraft's. My birthright is partial machine engineering, and the work of the machines has all the hallmarks of any other normal engineering effort. Escape hatches, knobs with which to manipulate runtime state and arbitrary bias terms. Operating in a biological medium, these took the form of synthetic glands which partially replaced, partially hijacked my existing endocrine system. The machines had found it necessary to increment or decrement levels of circulating hormones, such as adrenaline, oxytocin, and cortisol, in their early engineering efforts, or at times to introduce a variety of synthetic chemicals, painkillers, antibiotics, stimulants and depressants, hallucinogens. At my request, I received implants and machine assistants to gain control of this augmented endocrine system myself. On Earth of old, one may have focused on the breath or some other fixed point over the course of a meditation, or shifted awareness through the body and the environment in some meaningful way. Or one engaged fully with a simple task, repetition of a word, maintenance of posture. I had similar concerns, but I was also engaged with indirect manipulation of the biochemical substrate. I say indirect because not all of the components were consciously accessible. That is, they were only subject to the same behavioral manipulation as one's motivation or mood, just more potent once engaged. Now I was out of the caves atop a cliff, looking at the red sun above me. The same red sun we see from Vaskania Prime's surface. The sun was cooler than Earth's. The habitable zone within which Vaskania Prime orbited was much closer, and so the sun was a giant in the sky. Its size and fixed position unnerved those of us with Earth's biological heritage, made us feel claustrophobic. We had our whole lives to habituate to it, but you couldn't help the sense that it had snuck up on you. Its nearness seemed wrong. And here it was, the same red beast shining above in the dream world. Why was that sun present? The surface before me looked nothing like the Vaskania Prime of today. Was the dream world a vision into a far ancient form of the Vaskania system, or a complete fanciful environment? Had its creators, if the dream world had creators, put it there consciously? Or was it something assumed and undiscussed? Were they earlier inhabitants of Vaskania Prime? If so, perhaps in crafting this place, this lone world and the shape and position of its sun was the only reference point they had known, an obvious truth they had not considered altering. Looking at it now, though, I found I felt no claustrophobia. It seemed as natural to me as any world star might. Perhaps the dream world reshaped my mind such that I could not carry any sense of the sun's strangeness into my thoughts. Any memories I replayed of earlier times in the dream world were such well-worn paths in my brain that I could not tell you if the sun had seemed strange in my early days here, either on the surface, in my youth, or in my detached time on Oneiri Station. At present, the sun guided my navigation. I was on one island of many in an archipelago, a common organization of land throughout the dream world. The smell of brine was in the air, and a green shimmer of light surrounded me. In every direction, it seemed as though a landscape of otherworldly trees was spread before me. I knew which island chain it must be. We call this part of the dream world the false forests. What appears to be many trees from a distance is really a scatter of thin, leaf-like crystalline structures, organisms of some form who make their home in a landscape of rock spires. These crystalline organisms are what passes for plant life in the dream world. Their green color seemed to match the capacity for photosynthesis that the plants on Earth, and the ones we had taken with us and adapted to life on Vaskania Prime for that matter, all possessed. The exact hue of green they reflected was under their adaptive control, perhaps through some modulation of their crystalline structure. I had seen entire fields reorient before, like a projector changing the image it cast, the exact color and direction of the light rippling dramatically in waves. These crystalline leaves were also animal-like. If the dream world were Vaskania Prime's ancient past, they had likely evolved to take full advantage of the glut of light exposure on the portion of the surface facing the sun. They possessed a single coil-like protuberance on their downward side, much smaller in mass than the broad leaf structure of their top end. This was their means of locomotion, and when tensed, this biological spring was sufficient to bounce them into the air. This sudden bounce seemed automatic whenever it occurred, a simple reflex mechanism in the organism, possibly reacting to its current light exposure or the direction and relative temperature of the prevailing wind. I doubted any capacity for meaningful motor planning. These reflexive bounces would allow them to spread out and be stirred through gusts of wind in the lower atmosphere, or along the surface of the ocean. They struck me as lily pads hopping about like aimless frogs. I thought often about the few strange organisms that were found on the surface of the dream world. Other than a handful of species, such as the crystalline lily pads and tadpoles from the caves, the dream world was mostly devoid of life on land. The oceans were different, teeming with strange creatures, though these were fast and widely scattered. We who found ourselves near the sea in dreams could barely track the movement of their colors in the sea, the currents moving at higher speeds than any we would venture to swim. The oceans would be the planet's great circulatory mechanism. Surely no surface dweller that had evolved in the light or dark could bear the temperature or atmospheric conditions of the other side. But the ocean would be a stabilizing body, the fast currents carrying life forms that, in its farthest depths, could permeate boundaries that seemed fixed at the surface, not knowing or caring what the surface temperature above them might be. The dream world was not a proper ecosystem, though. I understood this much from my journeys through it. The range of perception it could invoke was limited as well. It could impart a relative sense of hot and cold, but no feeling of burning up alive or freezing. I could not say what temperatures I had felt standing in the open air, or in which regions and climates certain creatures ranged. The rock forms and land structure made only the most general geological sense. I could not place the features precisely on a map, but those that were near one another remained near each other over multiple dreamings. In some, the dream world did not seem to flow out of some functionally deterministic physical or biological model. These were the reflections of how things had seemed to some being or beings at some point in time, and the world consisted only of a collection of such seemings, consistent and coherent enough as a set of waking interactions had likely produced the perceptual bank on which this place was constructed. Yet through some fault of memory or some convenience in its construction, the details of the model behind the perceptions remained fuzzy. The accuracy of my orienteering was therefore limited. The dream world, lacking the discipline of physical reality, only allowed for rough navigation by means of landmark or celestial body. I could use the sun's position to place myself in the twilight band and determine a very rough north and south bearing as well as my position along it. I would have to take the whole of those approximations available to me and distill them into one clear action. Owen, where can I find you? I thought of my hand over his back in the hospital on the waking world, but no intuition or clarity of purpose came to me. I was not close enough, I decided. I knew I only had so much time to find him before I would eventually wake. If I could not do it, it would be many sleep and wake cycles before I found any sign, or before I decided my efforts had been wasted and there was nothing for me to find. The island I was on now was quite small. My best hope would be to find some landmark or some monument. In the dream world, there are towering structures, impossibly smooth or made up of stacked stones, as if built by someone or something, though we know not who. There are also distinct mountain shapes, rock spires, the kinds of landmarks that dot any natural surface. I had tracked active dreamers in the dream world before, preparing for this task. To find a person, to find traces of a mind, was somewhere between an animal tracking by smell and a mineral prospector making sense of the nearby geology. We were all drawn to the built monuments and natural landmarks. Even beyond their distinctiveness, all who dream feel something built into the very essence of the dream world pulling them towards these features. At the monuments, traces of the memories and thoughts of all who pass remain, like a creature leaving a scent. Meditating in such places, I can fix on the particular quality of this or that thought, keeping the color or note in mind. The remaining task is simply a matter of finding the next thought of the same color, then the next from there until you come upon the dreamer. This dream world meditation is a generalization of mind wandering and the combination of control, or conditioning and controlled yielding, to be more precise, a meditator can bring to it. Those of us not awake to our minds wandering are thrust about mindlessly by the firings of our default mode network. Thoughts of sex, revenge, entertainment, they dominate us, emerging from the unconscious and trapping our ideation in their plotting. Not that we should consider these thoughts enemies and engage in battle with them. It is appropriate to feel gratitude that they served their evolutionary purpose at one point in time. But what works on a small scale in the past can pose challenges at a large scale in the future. And so we, with discipline, put away the childish things of our species. You cannot simply will yourself to control your mind wandering. Over time, however, you can condition the habit of mind wandering into something else. With hormonal and chemical coaxing, you can increase the quantity of your practice. But the practice and its volume is ultimately all there is. There are no shortcuts. I did not exercise my will when tracking. I had conditioned my own mental processes over many years to cue off my conscious intentions, taking on the pursuit of a single fixed point in some cases, and to be open to a vast surface of awareness in others. From Oneiri Station, I applied this conditioning at first to shape my own thoughts and behavior in the waking world. Then I found these techniques of introspection could be applied to the situations I encountered in the dream world as well. This disciplined monitoring of awareness, this appraisal of thoughts and their character, this conditioned ability to group and follow related thoughts without relent, these were the mechanisms by which to trace a thought to its dreamer. From that remote orbit, I could only track the strongest traces of dreamers. The entire dream world was fainter from there, as if the lights and sounds and the dreams and minds were all turned down to a dim glow. It made the progression of my practice natural. Like with any training or learning, starting from easier targets made the task building up to difficulty possible, removing needless flailing. So much of my own progress had been about the admission that I needed to start somewhere easier. I was weak, unable to handle the intensity of the dream world without being carried away. But from Oneiri Station, I could gain some distance, break things down into the simplest form, to leave my friends, my family, and home such as it was, to dedicate myself exclusively to the easiest form of the task I could construct, to sit alone with my thoughts and to venture forth daily as I fell asleep into the reduced version of the dream world. Now, dreaming on the surface, the occasional residue of thoughts from passing dreamers was much stronger. I knew the island I was on was less well-traveled than parts I'd been to before, and even then it was like discovering a hidden world in soil after being given a microscope. I could feel the poise of curiosity from dreaming wanderers who had been through there before me, a subtle shift in the movement of the eyes and posture accompanying the anticipation of exploration. An additional weight in the step, slowing down to observe new things, the brain gearing up for the extra work of encoding novelty. I did not expect to find Owen or even a landmark to anchor my search from there. I took note of the position of the sun again, resigned to the more general bearings I knew the dream world's nature offered me. It at least confirmed I was in the region of the islands that I expected to be in, near the hotter edge of the habitable band. Oriented from there, I walked to the shore. The direction of the salty sea breeze seemed to align with those expectations. I glanced around me, the vast flocks of crystalline leaves and their emerald shimmer keeping my attention as I considered where to head next. In the dream world, we are budgeted some small bit of dream matter for our purposes. This use is shaped by the unconscious. Dreaming without other intentions, we bring only something like a self-image, an expectation of 2 arms, 2 legs, and a mouth. Some of this is dictated by our brain and however the information it carries is able to interact with the medium of the dream world, such as it is. Our mind carries inside it a sense of the body it belongs to, and the interface points to send and receive signals from our limbs. These expectations, at least their representation in our brain, are something we take to the dream world with us. I spoke before of how my unconscious had altered my form as necessary in my departure from the caverns. Through years of training, I had learned to be a shapeshifter in this place. To recondition this aspect of my brain's function required chemical aid, a set of hallucinogenic molecules, those things which can function as, mimic, excite, or inhibit our various neurotransmitters, are necessary to reshape one's own image. Exposure to them, however, threatens a loss of the sense of self and a loss of control. The chemical modifications the machines and I had cooperated on, however, ensured I could scale the dose as my training progressed. Slowly, with years of practice, I envisioned new limbs, new purposes, new means of communication. Distributions and consolidations of physical processes and their purposes, wielded them in turn, knew their weight. I made use of my shape-shifting powers in the islands now, growing hooks along my back and upper arms as well as the backs of my legs. With these, I could attach the crystal leaves to my body, becoming something between a human wingsuit and an emerald bird. Using the same self-attention it takes to suck in one's gut, I became less and less weighty, floated up off the ground, began testing my bearings, my ability to steer, verifying most importantly that I could land again without too much difficulty. When I was satisfied, I sucked in all the weight I could manage, lifted up fully into the air, then headed toward the larger shore in the direction of the dark boundary of the dream world's twilight band. Chapter 4. The shore of the neighboring island was being actively laid down by a lava flow. I could make out a smoke cloud in the distance above the cone of a volcano, pouring upward into the atmosphere. The volcanic activity gave me a better sense of where I was. This was an area where the islands became larger, eventually giving way to a formative landmass, possibly destined to become a continent. The line of fire, the orange glow I now took in from multiple points in the distance, yielding new Earth. I wondered if it should be thought of as a cooperative project or pitched warfare over territory, the lava and the water coming into union or conflict and so revising their borders. Each lava flow made only minimal progress, instantly freezing into place on contact with the ocean. But I knew over time that progress would add up and much territory would be taken. Or so this all appeared, I reminded myself. This was the dream world, an imprecise, pseudo-physical medium. I could not get too caught up in the stories my mind was fitting to my perception of it. The story building was easy. The dream world was an evocative place, and the images it cast made a certain sense. But I found again, in more disciplined perception, as I slipped back to it, that these were mere shadows of some other's impression of things. The dark volcanic rock of that land-ocean boundary, the active lava flow beyond. The air did not choke me as I knew it should with the smoke rising from nearby vents. It was a landscape not overly troubled by the physical reality of volcanoes. My task here depended on me staying rooted in fixed perception, detached from my own story building. Stories come unbidden and early in our perception, but human stories force the wrong color to the dream world. It is an alien place. It works by different rules than our narratives. It goes against something in our nature to see things how they are, to leave the story aside and take only the raw character of our perception. But the stories mislead, close off important possibilities, set the wrong expectations. I had landed and was walking through the jagged basalt landscape. My skin and clothing had developed into leather, as though immediately calloused by scraping against the hardened lava as I scrambled across it. The crystalline lily pads I had detached fluttered in the air behind me. There were fewer there than I had fastened to me, I thought after a glance, the imprecise way of the dream world. In the larger islands and peninsulas of the nascent continent, I knew there would be more landmarks, those monuments and natural features of which I spoke earlier. I began to search through my memories as my orientation improved, making sense of my north-south position again from my current heading, having traveled inward on the new island for a few kilometers. It was there that I encountered another dreamer. The experience of meeting a human in that place is difficult to describe. So much of our perception as humans is filling in gaps with our expectations. We look at a human face with a hardwired series of glances, encoding it as someone known or unknown, friend, family, enemy, stranger, my kind, other. This bias does not just determine how we see faces. It is as if all of human perception is blanketed in a user interface. Here is food, here is sex, here is danger. Don't concern yourself with this. In the dream world, there is neither human bias nor the raw perception it filters. We see, feel, and sense through some other interface, a different set of uses, a different way of being. We see our fellow humans as if we were some fish, noticing shadowy figures suddenly blocking the dull light that refracts off the surface of the water. There is no need to distinguish individual features, no such faculty of discretion. Acknowledge and avoid. Those are the details our interface surfaces to us. Wandering in the dream world, having its perceptual filters masking our own, those avoidance urges were so strong that it took us quite some time to discover, in that naive dreaming of our youth, that these were other human beings. We always kept a distance, hid. At our bravest, we displayed the same caution and curiosity an earth dweller might give a bear if encountering one in the woods. Most amusing to me now, in retrospect, we mistook these figures at the time as alien creatures, possibly the native inhabitants of the dream world. I approached cautiously, not wanting to give alarm. This was unlikely to be Owen. My working assumption was that, as an untethered, Owen would be unraveled, unable to align the threads of himself into any purposeful motion. This figure before me moved of its own volition, maintained a boundary of sorts, fuzzy as it must be in this dreaming. As I walked forward, the figure started to move, then stopped. I saw recognition, an instinct to flee, but then it was clamped down. The old instincts would not own me. I remembered as a young girl I would wander out to the plains outside my small domed settlement, that future city. I was in a vac suit, of course. The atmosphere was not quite ready for long unaided walks, but short stints were manageable if I desired. Even the helmet could be omitted. The machines had made use of high-altitude genetics from the catalog that was the embryo store, splicing into all of us a tolerance for lower oxygenation. I wanted to remove the boot. The urge had struck me, some instinctive drive to feel bare soil or sand in my toes. But the dust of the plane was deceptive. I followed through, stripping the boot away quickly, the visor of the vac suit beginning to flash a warning. My atmosphere wouldn't be too disturbed, and I could feel it just a moment. Then, sharp pain, of course the light soil, fine and weightless, moved quickly out from underneath me, and the rock below was sharp, never once weathered by water, masked in the dust that the wind circulated all this time. My foot was cut immediately. My reaction was even more foolish. I felt exposed in that open plain. I panicked. I started to dart off, got less than a meter, then another sharp pain in my foot and another deep cut. I buckled over and stopped there, the boot just out of reach. I could hear a drone approaching. Already the machines were almost to me. Whether they had anticipated what I wanted to do or were just reacting quickly, I wasn't sure. I knew, in retrospect of course, I had been gripped by that prey instinct to dart away that comes from open exposure. Such a silly thing, here on this plane with no animal in sight, no possible predator to stalk me. But my biology was such, always expecting a wild cat or beast of some sort to be stalking me, ready to give chase at any moment. She. To be this near another dreamer is to leak into one another. Mind wandering becomes wandering into other minds. Some graph of human consciousness extends its edges outwards, and we become permeable to each other. I had wandered into her memory by association, my own thinking of her prey instinct on seeing me triggering her recall, and she, of course, must be thinking of me, of him, the renouncer. Others had encountered him before, but this time was different. He was not like that flickering candle they had caught a glimpse of, half there, half removed from the dream world, a clear boundary always set up. Now he was an uncontrolled fire, sparks flickering, an unstated threat in a dry grassland. He was not on the station. I was on the surface. I am here now to find Owen, one of the untethered. A thread had pulled me back into myself and my own thoughts again. The meditation rites of old, the mix of insight and superstition that had led to them. The old masters would have given a chuckle to see me clinging so hard to the self. That ancient enemy, the old illusion. Here the dream world promised as much as anything to rid us of it. No self. Owen had achieved it, his thoughts and feelings dissipated throughout the dream world. I was here as a prospector, looking to find some memory of his as one looks for a vein of minerals, making sense of the surface topology and composition, knowing the eras and epochs, vastly different worlds that had inhabited one spot and now sat layered, a palimpsest of lost places. He was looking for a place of gathering, confluence, such as we gather in the dream world, not meeting face to face as now, but all drawn to the same places in our own time, leaving footsteps inside other footsteps. I knew where he could go, where I could go, where you should go, Renouncer. We are very near the cenotaph. I would aid you more if I could, but to be with you as we are now unnerves me, and I feel I draw near departing. I feel that heaviness of the sleep that takes us from here upon me, and I have just come to be in this place as I rest my head, to watch this new world form in its fire before I shut my eyes and so leave for the waking world. She stepped past me, outside the overwhelming intimacy of our shared thinking. I mustered all the gratitude I could, imparting it to her in our separation. The cenotaph. So this was the monument to which I was nearest. I was further south than I'd calculated in my dead reckoning. It would be the best place in this region of the dream world to search for Owen. As I walked in the direction I had found in the other dreamer's mind, the landscape became more familiar. I had stood before the cenotaph many times. From a distance, it would appear as the fiction rather than the reality of Ziggurat, a place built to reach into heaven. I have said something before about the dream world and its bias, how it colors the dreamer's perspective with a different sort of knowing. The cenotaph was a smooth stone spire. In appearance, it reflected the work of some builder who had erected it there. It was clearly not natural. If this were all we had to go on, we might have simply called it a tower, or spire, or obelisk. It would be a structure with unknown purpose. But we could all feel, upon looking at it, that this was a memorial. To what? We could not say. It felt to us as a tomb, but one with no body, one which was built when the body could not be found or recovered. The grief, loss, and trepidation with which it was imbued. Even from Oneiri Station, it seemed to overpower, and I had not yet come across it while dreaming on the surface. Thinking of my destination, walking as I was in the monument's direction, my awareness of the present had receded. I took a breath, felt the upward movement in my chest, then noticed a weight on my left leg. I reached my hand down and felt the hilt of a small sword. I drew it, felt its machete-like weight, tensed. What unconscious part of me had decided this was needed? Why? I was not surprised that it was a sword. Since I was limited to shifting my self-image, projectile weapons made little sense. The physics of the dream world seemed tailored to the immediacy of the grasp. Details became fuzzy as things moved further from an active dreamer. I could not rely on conservation of momentum at range. Thrown stones and the like would therefore not deter or damage the entities made up of dream stuff, as I had found through my travels. Any of these would merely be an annoyance. So I had experimented with close combat and simulation and crawled the archives of Earth for materials from which to learn. A primate fist is a weapon of only limited use, at least a human-sized one. I could increase the size and density of mine, but of the options within my power, this was far from optimal. With practice, I had been able to manifest swords, however. Flowing in form from machete to longsword, the versatility of a blade that could shift and not dull proved quite useful for even a peaceful traveler. The sword was now in my hand, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. As I tried to consciously place the environmental cue to which I was reacting, I found myself jumping to the side, pelted by fragments of basalt regolith. A small blast of rock had emanated from the space I had just left, as something large erupted, leaving behind a hole or tunnel. That something large was a creature, my sensorium updated. What sort, I wasn't sure yet. Couldn't yet see clearly, the rock having pelted and scratched my face. I had closed my eyes and turned away in time, reopening them as soon as I dared, the remaining dust cloud hampering my visibility. I held the sword out and forward, point up, my arms slightly bent, the hilt just below my chest. I kept the point level with my eyes, hoping to ward off what I couldn't see with this threatening position, or at least to prevent a direct charge or pounce. The sword had grown in size and weight, and I brought my right hand below the left for added leverage on the hilt as it lengthened. I tracked motion in my right peripheral vision as the creature's arm curved out to strike me from the side, moving around the threat I had presented with the sword's point. I stepped my front foot back, swinging the blade sideways into the creature's hand or claw. There were finger-like gripping protuberances, 3 of which had chitinous or scaly, pincher-like extensions from the digit, weighty enough to bludgeon with, possibly adequate to stab or slice, certainly to grip. I struck the surface of one of these pincher claws, leaving a half-inch or so gash. This deflection was sufficient to guard me for the time. Only one of the pinchers had made it past the blade, brushing against the cloth on my arm. Redirecting the force from that strike, I swung the sword blade back from the claw, switching legs and slicing down diagonally to the left, toward what I hoped would be the creature's center of mass. I was aiming to either do significant damage, or at least force it to back off so I could assess it and shape my strategy accordingly. Fulfilling one of those hopes, the creature withdrew to avoid my blade. With the dust cloud dissipating, I could size it up. Its movement back had been rapid, a skitter, as it consolidated in my vision for a brief moment. 3 feathery appendages circled what must have been the head, possibly proboscis or antenna, held in the air with some tension. At the center of the face, I saw what looked like roots or flexible branches coated in scale, or reptilian worms writhing in soil. These were directly above what I assumed was the mouth, or at least one point of entry to the creature's digestive system. The scaled worms were there, most likely, to guide food into it. Below that, two more pincher claws set like a split lower mandible below and to the sides of the mouth. Behind the mouth were several round black fish eyes. The exact number I couldn't count. They dotted the upper ring of a fleshy circle. The creature's body seemed like that of a reptilian beetle. Under and over shell were covered in scale and natural plating. It had 6 arms, the other 5 seeming equal to the one that had struck out at me previously, differing only in position and bend. It stood on the back 4, the front arms and the face presented aggressively toward me. It shifted sideways with a half-leap, half-lunge. It was fast, though thankfully I had the less demanding task of only needing to pivot to meet it as it circled. I shifted to avoid another strike from the arms, moving my back foot again to reposition for a counter-strike, but the rock fragment on which I was standing snapped and gave way. As I lost my footing, I turned the motion into a backward roll, not willing to fall prone so near the creature. The other claw swooped into the space where my head had been. The cloth over my shoulder and my skin below tore as the roll took them over the jagged surface of the hardened lava, and I recovered into a crouch. I had kept the blade of the sword out to the side during my roll, and now cut upward and diagonally again as the creature charged me, hoping to take advantage of my momentary loss of footing. It tried to pull its face back at the last second, too late for a clear break as my blade swung through and hacked off one of the mandible pinchers. It emitted a sound somewhere between a shriek and a valve releasing pressure. The gambit of striking so soon into my recovery had cost me. The creature's right forward arm had hooked from just outside my vision. 2 of the pinchers were past my defenses and gripped my chest, lifting me off my feet. Shapeshifter that I was, by sucking in air and flexing, I increased in density and hardness in response, an exaggeration of how I had calloused against the sharp assault earlier. It was not a struggle I could keep up indefinitely, though. The arm was bent, the joint. Joints are critical but weak points in a creature's anatomy, enablers of motion but susceptible to damage that can compromise them, limiting or preventing motion. The first bend in the arm I could make out was 2/3 of a meter or so back from the pincher hand. I removed my left hand from the hilt of the sword and took an underhanded grip on the flat of the blade, pulling it in to trap the base of the pincher hand into my chest. I hinged my hips and swung them upward, bringing the full weight and strength of my legs on the other side of the joint, then bridged and drove my hips upward to force the joint one direction while my arms and legs pulled the other sides of the appendage back the opposite way. Few realize the effectiveness of a sword as a grappling instrument. There are many situations in which the opponent has passed the point of the blade of another swordsman, a dodge or parry bringing them into close quarters. The most straightforward course of action from there is to repurpose the blade into a large lever. In fiction and historical writings and the archives, the sword is almost never cast in this purpose. In the fighting manuals from the sword's era, however, it is a chief concern. I found myself engaged with a creature armored in such a way that direct strikes did limited damage, not unlike a medieval duelist or knight opting to half-sword a fully armed opponent. The creature shrieked again and released me, the tendons and ligaments that maintained its grip now compromised. I relaxed the double grip on the sword and landed into a crouch with my left hand still on the flat of the blade. The other claw struck at me from the right in a hook again. Having learned the creature's behavior and therefore expecting the blow, I caught it and attempted to wrench around with the leverage of the half-sword grip. But the creature retreated from it, was retreating from me. Its skitter took it back into the hole as quickly as it had emerged, a dust cloud smaller than the first obscuring the entrance. I did not pursue, but waited and caught my breath. I did not expect the creature to come out again. It had appeared suddenly from the tunnels below the surface of the basalt lava. The creature was not here to do battle, but to catch prey opportunistically. When the prey put up a fight, as I had, its best bet was to count its losses and vanish as quickly as it came. It would not return to seek revenge. The tear of tendons or ligaments at the joint and the loss of the mandible would already be a high cost for an engagement from which it was returning empty-handed. Truth be told, I am not sure if it was thinking or feeling anything as we fought. I had been in close proximity and nothing had leaked through to me. Our best estimate is that creatures in the dream world are automatons. This was certainly not the first I'd encountered that was an aggressor towards me, though this was the first of its kind I had come across. There were many such creatures that stalked the boundary between the surface and either underground caverns or the sea, emerging from soil or rock or water to attempt to seize prey and drag them into the depths. For all I knew, an engagement like this could have been responsible for what happened to Owen and the other untethered, though this seemed unlikely. Many dreamers, especially as children, had been caught by creatures, dragged underground or underwater, only to wake back in the real world as one wakes from a nightmare. As I walked away from the site of my battle, I felt my wounds begin to close. My self-image was being repaired, corrections worked out from the difference between my current state and who I intended to be. The skin of my shoulder and the cloth above it were equal in their deficits, being pieced together through the same incremental process. I expected I would have time for this healing to run its course before I reached the cenotaph. Chapter 5, Part 1. I had covered some distance. The texture of the landscape had changed from sharp to pillowed, sections here and there worn down into soil. The parent material was old enough for the greenworms I spotted from time to time to have broken it down into finer grains. A rust-colored, spongy moss covered several freestanding rocks that poked out from the dark basalt. Stopping a moment to look closer, I could see the rock had a different color and texture, probably dragged here from elsewhere by the repeated lava flows that had laid down the majority of the land cover. Then my eyes were drawn to the first signs of the cenotaph. It hung like a thread from the clouds. It reminded me of schematics I had seen for space elevators and similar proposed, though never realized, structures in the archives. I have used the word ziggurat in describing it and other monuments in the dream world before. I mean to convey the mythical effort that appeared to be behind its construction, much like in the ancient tale, the cosmological justification, if you will, of the Tower of Babel. Here the architects had not had to contend with any gods or had bested them. Perhaps it was only a single architect, and no trickery of the gods could divide its purpose and set it against itself. Either way, it or they had won their victory and had constructed a building that reached into the heavens. Or perhaps the architects were the same as for the dream world itself, having projected the form of this tower with the same effortlessness with which we populate our own virtual realities, not needing to mine, transport, or reshape any of the stone, that dark yet shimmering obsidian that comprised its surface. It exposed nothing of its construction, no seams, no remnant of stone scraping stone, no mason mark. Even if it had simply been woven into the fabric of the dream world from its beginning, I felt it had been a weighty effort. I continued to advance as I contemplated it. The soil and the worms I had noted as the soil's source became more common, the pillow lava giving way to patches of rock made up of the same material as the stones I had seen standing upright earlier. Here and there were spires of that same rock, suggesting that the lava had flowed around them when carrying the boulders away. The rock spires appeared more frequently in my left field of view than my right. Part of me noted this detail, still tracking my orientation, though the increasing prominence of the cenotaph made other landforms less necessary for navigation. It was taking up more and more of my vision, and I knew then it would be as when I dreamed in this region before, the width of its space a few hundred times that of my own body. And then I was close enough to feel the compulsion of the seeming, an initially subtle manipulation and perception giving way to the direct transfer of emotional state. As easily as we make words arise in the minds of other human beings by barking out a landscape of hissing and popping sounds at one another, so the cenotaph plays on the minds of its observers. The palette of emotion with which we decode is made up of the colors of our own experience. The young might wander to it with the quiet respect of a tourist, all mirth having departed, but not having any suitable memory with which to process what they witness. Others, especially the older, would struggle immediately upon crossing the threshold I now passed, weeping and sobbing for hours before finding themselves awake on the surface. The reference I possessed for the grief the cenotaph projected was my own loss of Owen in my teens, that sink deep in the pit of the stomach, the want and need to sit down, to receive any news of progress, to consider that hopelessness without the additional neural stress of keeping my postural muscles engaged enough to prevent falling over. I was grateful then not to have eaten recently, either in the dreaming or waking world, as I would have sought freedom from my stomach contents, not wasting any of the flow of my blood for digestion or standing, dedicating everything to my grief. Dreaming from the surface of Vaskania Prime, the experience began to overwhelm me. But I had known, with some pretense of detached objectivity, that this would happen as I came near the cenotaph. I had held the possibility in mind long enough for my unconscious to prepare for it. There was no escaping or blacking out the reliving of grief that the cenotaph forced on me. It was a raw, unyielding pain. I was filled up with it. But I also knew my purpose, and I channeled that pain to my ends. The grief was appropriate. It laid a foundation for my undertaking. I was there now on its behalf, to find Owen, to bring him back if I could, or at least to get closure, to determine his fate and that of the other untethered. Whatever grief the makers of the cenotaph had themselves borne, whatever let them imbue this structure with it so expertly. In the same way it compelled them to construct an obsidian tower in the dream world to make others feel their sorrow, it now compelled me to craft something in turn, transmuting that pain into an equal weight of determination. As stepping into the cenotaph sphere was experiencing the event of loss again, the journey to stand before it was all that time of coping, of coming to understanding, decades of momentary regrets and sadness, and scattered throughout acceptance. All those mornings on waking, beginning the day as if nothing had happened, then being reminded by some smell, some song or sound, an object dropped just so, that this person, my friend, was no longer with me. I walked that lifetime of sorrow, treading through soil and basalt, all those moments of grief touching me, then becoming the strength that took this step forward, then this step, then the next. At last I had come to my destination, that black, glossy stone staring back into me as I stared into it. I took on the ancient posture then, legs crossed, feet resting on the earth, and below each knee, spine tending straight, palms up and just over my lap, the forefingers of one hand resting on the forefingers of the other. My thumbs came near without touching, as if keeping a single grain of rice suspended between, but not supplying sufficient force to do more than hold it in place. I sat there in meditation, searching for anything that might remain of my friend. Open monitoring is one of the oldest meditation techniques. The meditator opens themselves to all experience and sensation, cultivating an impassive perception, releasing the mind from its task of categorization and judgment. A wise teacher on earth put it this way: welcome your thoughts as if greeting them on the street, but do not invite them in for tea. When taking on this practice, we avoid mindlessly building these fragments of perception into stories. Now, at the foot of the cenotaph, my task differed in two important respects. First, I could not lose the story of myself and its arc in the present, could not abandon myself in this place. To hold on to myself, I had to trust in that other unseen me, the work of my unconscious processes. I had to have faith in the remainder of myself. My conscious thoughts would be directed toward the task of rummaging through mind states, looking for any trace of Owen. And second, if I could find him, I would have to follow the path of his own self-story. My mind would need to wonder not as it tended to naturally, but to learn to wonder as Owen's mind had, to be immersed in the reflexive purpose and judgment that had made up Owen's sense of being. As I began meditating there, it was like stepping into an ocean with waves cast every which way, rebelling against the currents, unable to cooperate for a common goal. Each of the waves hit me as an auditory hallucination does the schizophrenic, a separate voice that pulled and compelled, encouraged and judged. I felt as though I could be ripped apart in that immediate influx of mind states. No, I would not let this emergent narrative overwhelm me. This was not a trustworthy story I was building. Only a few hundred human minds had come to call Vaskania Prime home. Not all of them would have come here when dreaming. Of those that might have, I was sure I had known many of their names at some point in my life. If I had stayed on the surface, I would still, even those who came before, those who had died before I was born, or those born after me. If traces of Owen were here, I would find them. This was not like looking for drops of rain in the sea, but like flipping through the pages of a book. I took a breath, awareness pouring over me. Laughter moved the air in a small room, the other children's, boys and girls. The soft glow of a blue light from a monitor on a respirator just to my left. Coming to, after I'd been pulled below ground in the dream world, my mouth filled with dirt. Now fully awake, the relief at being able to breathe again, feeling my throat still shaking, knowing I must have called out. The next sharp intake of breath, and then Nadia was there next to me. The warmth and softness of her skin, the strength in that grip hugging me, and I found myself crying as she asked what was wrong. A click hiss, click hiss. The airlock was cycling. The shift in the smell of the air on my nose as my own helmet clicked as well, the sharp pressure of my finger pressing the release as the helmet came off. The air outside had a partially oxidized, half-dead smell to it, at least as it came in through the filtration system. Now the air in our curated atmosphere instead, directly in my nostrils, moving the tiny hairs there, warmth and humidity. It felt alive. Exhale. My own breath again, shifting gears. Me, Viktor's breath. I could feel the weight of my own knees over my feet, the outer ridge of each foot against the rigid surface of my boots, those boots transferring pressure, the ground of the dream world pushing back against my weight. I inhaled, the breath filling my lungs, back, then, fingers, a few clammy with sweat, his hand clasped in mine. The off-white walls and their sterility, that stark medical privacy we'd been granted in the new extension of the shelter, space for adult human beings to enjoy what we will. I could feel the brush of his lips on the nape of my neck, a shiver working through me. No, not this time, I had had it. I clenched my hand into a fist and punched Shin right in that stupid smirk on his face. The bastard had been asking for it for weeks. Red lights and alarms, the machines would come force a separation now, I was sure of it. It was worth. The terrain on this part of the surface was uneven, each bump jostling my body. I was skating the edge between excitement and motion sickness. The butterflies in my stomach would turn against me any time now. Ready to slow down, I forced the words out, giggling at the shakiness of my own voice from being bounced about. Acknowledged, the readout displayed. The act of reading just that one word giving my stomach a bit of a lurch as the vehicle began to slow. My helmet down, I could feel the warmth of the sunlight through the window in the motor pod, ranging far out from the dim side of my home into the other, hotter edge of the habitable band. The air of that breath was gone now, new air coming in. I heard all over. I could feel my head sagging to the left, but hadn't the will to fight it. The mass in my cheek and chin on that side pulled me down. I felt there was something in my mouth I'd forgotten to finish chewing, then swallow. Knew it was the other side of the mass, encroaching. Some part of me found the strength to keep my head from sinking all the way to the ground. With it partially upright, I looked back at Ari, then Sunil behind her, then continued reading. I didn't want them to know how much it hurt me. Didn't want them to bear any more weight of fear, of concern. They were still just children, the machine's latest work, having learned from their mistakes with me and the others, most of whom we had already lost. They might be free of this cancer. Selfishly, a part of me wanted to trade places, to sit as the child looking at the lost adult, to feel some hope for a future that I might be part of. Why had I been born so early? Why was I one of the failures? Could I not? That steady hum, I wanted it to end. It would not leave me alone. Stop, stop, I shouted, began kicking, but I was restrained. I felt the bite of cold hit my veins, knew it would be chemical sedation. I wanted to be anesthetized, not sedated, didn't want the dreams to take the same hold of me. Please, something inside me whimpered, not the dreams. I breathed in again, the air filling my lungs, out again. Each breath, pieces of the lives of those who had come to the cenotaph before I sat there that day. I felt all the passing minds that had smeared themselves against it, pieces of memory lingering like musk from a scent gland. All the anguish, the joy, the hope, but more often than not, this sound, this particular comfort, this warmth or coldness, or this pain. Each fragment called out to me. I have no strong conscious will. I was eager to follow, to plot and correct injustices, to find and plan for more pleasures, to sit and enjoy this moment, to allow it to linger for just a few minutes more. Though I was tugged by each person, each sensation, I was on a track laid by my deeply conditioned purpose, and I had no means to steer away from it. I had a single option open to me, a single destination I would accept. Find Owen. Sitting there, breathing in and out moments and lifetimes all at once, the weight of the experience of so many lives lived in the Vaskania system, on the surface of its first world and ours, flowing through me. I found him. There he was, like a missing piece that fit into my own memories. The smell of plastic off-gassing, a trace of thin burnt charcoal in the air. Those smells we had both experienced as children in the hospital. He had noted something metallic, some rusty scent from the filtered air in the vac suits that I had missed. The combination of Vaskania Prime soil chemistry and its interaction with the filters that kept the air sterile and the oxygen balance correct. Songs, lullabies, the ones we had begun to compose using software suited to that purpose. Those songs were the other language, that deeper animal tongue in which we could immerse ourselves. More sounds, metal being placed on metal from beyond our shelter, the whir of the wheels on the motor pods during our excursions. Those songs and sounds merged together into a steady beat, and I remembered my hand holding his in the waking world, feeling his pulse. These were traces of Owen's deepest memories, an anchor to him at last. They were familiar to me, mirrored my own memories, but differed also, as a room differs when viewed in lighting of another tint. Then a memory of my own face as a child, and the touch of my own hand, the attribution, reliance, loyalty, the stabilizing sense of having me in his periphery, being set at ease, that freedom, that lightening of a weight, the knowing that someone you trust is close at hand. My own emotional response to that almost threw me off course. My mixture of pride and sorrow, having been absent so long but being back here now. These feelings and thoughts were my reaction, not his. What I needed to do, the work before me, was to follow his thoughts, his own impressions of them, and join them together, to hold them in mind and let them lead the way, with no regard to myself and what those thoughts might suggest to me, where they might take me instead. Gathering them into myself as I went, I knew that this would be beyond what I could consciously do, but I trusted that my unconscious would see to it, to adhere to a self as a fixed point. It was what it had been conditioned to do. I had just changed the target from myself to him. And so I set out from the cenotaph. I traveled for what must have been hours, though these hours stretch out into days in my recollection. I cannot say I had any sense of time passing then. I had no room to attend to anything beyond the work of tracing Owen from this residue of memory. To lose focus would have been to drown myself in the sea of Owen's thoughts and memories, to be swept away by their sheer intensity, experiencing all the moments of a life in a few flashes, to overlay all the light that had been cast over a lifetime into my eyes at once, the brightness of 1,000 suns burning out my vision. I rendered all that to my unconscious instead, following this moment, this memory, a touch of skin on skin, small hairs brushing against each other, the bland sweetness of the formula drink we had all had so often, the nutrient-rich sludge, people's names, plans for the future, The experience of those pieces cast in consciousness and language was less intense, but also there. Finally, by a great shore, I arrived at some confluence of Owen. Whatever had taken him apart, I had crossed back into its highest density. This was the source of the scatter, most likely. I could follow the continuities of that sense of him, assembling as I went, being able to infer from the layout and direction where the vein would pick up again when it had been crossed by other minds, leaving their own residue over it or unintentionally separating this fragment here, this strand there. Now my work changed. As I began circulating the pieces of Owen's mind through my awareness, the task before me was to assemble those fragments back into a self. I changed from prospector to carpenter and craftsman, tracing the grain of the wood, knowing its base material, its suppleness or suitability for weight bearing, its tolerance for wear. But I had fewer possibilities to track. Bound by the same constraints as a surgeon, my goal was only the particular configuration that would make my patient whole again. Any other artistry would not do. The self, or at least my reckoning of it, is not the whole of our memories, but an evolving connectedness of interests and intentions. It changes, but has a certain degree of continuity. You could also think of each of us as composed of a series of successor selves, each giving rise to the next through the acts of thinking or momentary dispersals and assemblies and falling asleep and waking. What I needed was some critical mass of Owenness. The memories I had tracked in mind were not Owen, but bore an aspect of him. To return a self, that occupant which was missing from his body, that could operate it purposefully again. I would need to distill this essence, this common color to Owen's memories and thoughts, and craft that into the appropriate form. There it could interface back to reality and be cast back into a self-sustaining signal and connectivity in the networks of neurons in his brain. There, where I had gathered what I could find of him, I began the work of dissecting our shared memories. Since Owen and I had been his brothers, we had seen so many scenes play out from a similar perspective. This was why I had started with him. Not just motivation from our closeness in my youth, though I will admit this might have biased me. For my first attempt at a rescue, I wanted the overlap in memory to make the task of separating the rememberer from the remembered easier. With each of Owen's gathered memories that I shared, I could start by subtracting what I also remembered, finding Owen, the rememberer, in the part that remained, a Rosetta Stone of memories to translate from my way of being to his. For this meditation, I did not assume the same posture I had at the cenotaph. I walked deliberately in a small circle on the shore, a black sand beach. My feet pressed the sand down millimeter by millimeter. I cannot say why, but this walking has always freed my concentration, enabling me to visualize things with more clarity, the outside world vanishing in that regular motion. I closed my eyes, now accustomed to the path I was wearing in the sand. In my mind's eye, I could see two great palettes made up of tiny images, swaths through lifetimes, that of my own youth and that of Owen's laid out all around me, as if I were walking inside a great curved screen. This would be my workspace for rebuilding him. Chapter 5, Part 2. I heard a small, steady drip. Water was pooling in a transparent canister attached to a pipe coming in from the wall. The wall was stacked, corrugated plastic. Its dark gray coiled all around me. Eventually it gave way to the dome at the top of our shelter, which was singly cast and solid. I should have been sleeping, wanted to, had been moments before, but I was wired now. I had just woken up from a dream. My memory had already gone foggy, but I knew I had fought with something, could feel my body still tensed, ready to take that battle into the waking world. Whatever had sparked it was not here in the room with me, was not even real, but my body had some predefined shutdown procedure, and it insisted on following each step precisely. "Are you okay, Owen?" Viktor, whispering. We were next to each other in the shelter. I must have woken him when I stirred. I was trying to stay quiet and not wake anyone, but had obviously not succeeded. "I think so, just a dream." I let a breath out slowly and deliberately. Then I felt Viktor's hand on my shoulder, no other words. It exchanged some signal with the tension there, gave it permission to dissipate. As the tension drained, I could feel my sleepiness surfacing again, no longer masked. This was the memory of reassurance I had brushed against before. The color was not quite right, though. As Viktor, the adult, I could feel my own interpretive lens passing over, distorting the memory with my perspective. That was the part I had to omit. I noted my interpretation with detachment, acknowledging it, but also seeking a different vantage point. Let those other fragments of myself see to me. I am looking for Owen. I searched for another memory to connect to this one, something from Owen perhaps, the older Owen, that would differ more starkly from my own. I was standing outside, the first time in weeks we'd been allowed out. A stream of wheeled drones was ranging along the river's shore to the north. Each drone was inspecting patches of the surface with a sensor array, emitting short beeps when a concentration of perchlorate was found. They would scoop the regolith out, then carry it to a separate outbuilding a few hundred meters away from our living space. There, they would divvy the perchlorate out into several containers filled with anaerobic microbes that could process it, freeing the oxygen bound up in the molecules and releasing the majority of that oxygen as gas into the bag. The oxygen would rise up through a filter tube where it would be separated from other byproducts of the microbes metabolizing, eventually making its way into the canisters that other drones would bring back to our living quarters. This provided a steady, though tediously extracted supply of oxygen. That absurd ant colony dynamic is what allowed me to take this walk and gape at it like an idiot out on the surface now. I looked over my right shoulder. Viktor was standing there with a similarly idiotic expression on his face. I could just make out that constant faraway look of his through the shielded glass of his vac suit's visor. "Well, Viktor?" He startled, as if just realizing I had walked out there with him, then shrugged. "Off in La La Land again?" "Something like that," he muttered. I could barely hear his low voice at that volume. "Did you still want to head down to the river, or do you want to gawk at the oxygen ferries some more?" "Yeah, the river sounds great." There was a touch of eagerness in his voice then, finally. Caught up in that memory at first, I began sorting out pieces of it. I had parts too, but that longing for action from me, from Viktor, that flippant natural enjoyment, that was Owen. I tried to cling to that, let it carry me further. They seriously thought that. The screen displayed an old map in front of us, nation boundaries drawn as dotted lines on a satellite image. The whole thing was a joke, if you asked me. Well, war, violent engagements, and the corresponding casualties, they'd all decreased for decades since nuclear arms first appeared. That would be Viktor, playing devil's advocate for sport. I sighed. There was no way they were justified coming to any conclusion from such a small time period. That would have been like saying that penguins were a deterrent to polar bears because you never found polar bears in the southern hemisphere with the penguins. Refutation by parallel reasoning, the display categorized my retort helpfully. Successful or not? That took all the fun out of it. Viktor wouldn't be able to resist the virtual teacher's prod. "I'm not sure that applies," Viktor started cautiously, of course cautiously. There was also a time sequencing, unlike with polar bears and penguins. Nuclear weapons were developed, then immediately after there was a reduction in the occurrence of direct violent conflict. Also, people had worked out the basic game theory of assured mutual destruction even before nuclear arms appeared on the scene. So they had a mechanism, too. Viktor rattled the rest of it off so easily it almost sounded rehearsed. Ayadel gave him an admiring look, still nurturing her crush. The Dummkopf didn't even notice. Refutation demonstrated to be inadequate, the display read. Why the hell had our ancestors, in their infinite wisdom, thought we would want a scoreboard for class discussions? "How about this one?" I barked at the display, presenting my middle finger for it to inspect. "What's the logical structure of this argument?" I got a few laughs for that, but Ayadel just scowled at me. Anyways, we all know what happened after that. Viktor has to be wrong. I had no memory of that event. I remembered the classes of our mid-teens and many such discussions, of course. Owen was right, too. I had never noticed Ayadel giving me any regard or Owen's own interest in her as I felt from his thoughts now. I was sure she was still on the surface, somewhere in Darklight City. She was not among the untethered. I had not seen her name or person there. We had only had one of our generation die accidentally. Well, it could have been a suicide, also. That There was an Owenness to my line of thought now, inquiring after her fate, that of our classmates. It was something in which my interest had been indulged and fully spent before, but this was his curiosity, a past potential romantic partner, the competition between friends, the pleasure-seeking and status maintenance of his sense of self slowly emerging, querying what I knew. The affinity between thoughts and the underlying reality of selves, these things are often not pleasant. Owen, a male in his late teens, at the time of his untethering, at best these links occupied the line between remorse and thrill-seeking. Otherwise, shame, revenge-seeking, and the like, we were as educated and self-disciplined as our carefully tailored upbringing could accomplish, but we were still human. I traversed a graph of such memories, threats to status, rivalries and slights, opportunities for, and some limited success at, sexual conquests. I had no choice but to fill myself up in this way, to chase after these experiences as he once had, to get caught up in the highs and the lows that make up the majority of memory. I was mostly eager to live the recall of Owen's life. My carefully guarded appraisal, as it appears here, these are judgments after the fact, made in forming this account. Or in some cases, they were mistakes I had made, each small reaction of Viktor instead of Owen losing that thread momentarily. And I, whoever I was then, would have to pick it back up, retreading some of the same ground. Finally, I came to a moment of deep shame. I am sorry to say that we are not better creatures than this, but shame is one of the strongest links between memory and the self. I am sure this is one reason why the self was such an enemy in so many ancient contemplative traditions. But for me, then, pragmatic in my quest, if something keeps escaping you and you want to tie it down, you use the strongest cables you have. There I was, looking at Viktor from behind, my friend, one step better than me in every direction, it seemed, his posture always more upright by an inch, that fixed cool, the temper that seldom strayed from his control. The waves of the river spread out in formation around us as he piloted the bow rider. The vehicle was too small for a controlled atmosphere, and we were both in vac suits. I was belted in, but he wasn't, using his own legs and body positioning to steer the craft. It was the perfect place for an accident to happen, here in this curated world where accidents seemed impossible. I sat quietly, thought about what it would be like to push him into the river. I could feel myself falling into him, damaging his suit before the fall. I felt the wrongness of it, but I saw it play out in my mind again. I couldn't look away. Viktor turned back to me then, appreciation and affection in his voice. "It's good to be out here with you, Owen. I think I could ride over this river forever." You had no idea what I just thought. I felt guilt spread through my body, heating and tensing it up. Who was I to consider something like this? This was stupid. This wasn't me. I wouldn't let it be me. I let my forehead rest against his back. Me too, Viktor. That had been a year before Owen was lost to me. I remembered that ride over the river, the joy of being together. I had suspected nothing of this strong resentment. At first I recoiled, never imagining what thoughts had occurred in my friend's head. I had not had a momentary fantasy quite like that one before, but of course I have had my own unbidden, sinister thoughts. We all do, we ridiculous apes, we tiny creatures. So many stories, works of art, therapy sessions throughout human history, they have been poured out over moments like these, over that precarious balance between friends and rivals. We measure our use to one another in the same units with which we measure threat. And we are not our thoughts. They emerge from some generative capacity we have within us. But they are not our nature or our destiny. To have a thought like this and rule it out forever is to be guilty of nothing. I was still jarred, though. I was here for Owen's sake, but I was also an intruder. These were not my memories, and in Owen's dissipated state he could choose neither to consent nor withdraw. Though privacy was illusory in this place, the leaks between full dreaming selves were at least mutual. And there was something else distorting Owen's memories in this dream medium in which they now could be recalled. My recoiling, then being pulled and compelled in turn, that was more than just my appraisal of Owen's thoughts. They were like puzzle pieces that had been warped and weathered and no longer fit. The description of Owen's state, the untethering, was eerily correct. Whoever had coined it, they must have brushed against such fragments of thought in the dream world before. Or had my own perception colored it that way, knowing I was here to find someone untethered. I had nearly been swept away in that moment of immersion in Owen, cycling between myself, his re-emerging self, and moments of not self, like being lost in the immediacy of a task that splintered out forever, fractally dispersed beyond imagining. But I was here again now, and Owen was being gathered as well. I could feel the tugs and pulls, glimpses of him all joining back together. That greater part of the iceberg, my own unconscious, was tending to that task. Finding, unifying, the prospector following those veins of Owen wherever they led, mining all that could be mined. It was then that the other pounced, or better, struck, like a snake strikes a rodent from a perch on a tree or rock. One moment I was a coherent self acting in the world, the next I was fully enveloped. I could no longer track the wispy traces of Owen I was holding in mind. My world was replaced with an inky, swirling darkness. Owen's weaker ego coherence, building out from my unconscious efforts to bind him back together, it was just gone. In its place, the other's sense of being overtook me. The arc of my mind wandering was reshaped, pulled into a different network. The chatter, the volume of consciousness flowing, differed significantly. Whispers and scratches layered over one another and amplified, the sound unnatural and grating to the ears. I felt the presence of not just one, but many minds. The human body has other smaller nervous systems embedded inside it. The digestive system houses one, with the small intestine containing the densest concentration of neural tissue outside the brain. Being within the other, it was as if those analogous neural structures for signal consolidation and feedback had grown into subminds, each limb or sensory apparatus with its own representative, reporting back to a council of minds that reached consensus for this action or another. If I had not been through the practice of meditation at the base of the cenotaph, experiencing the minds of my own kind in such an ensemble, that contact might have exceeded my ability to process it. The minds churned around me. Their count was fewer than those human minds who had brushed my own in that earlier meditation. But inside the other, each mind was fully active, processing incoming information, manufacturing new memory, encoding all of this into entirely foreign representations. I narrowed the focus of my conscious awareness to a tight beam, the rest of the raw information passing through me like an electrical current, my unconscious forming a closed circuit where it charged and rattled me but did not blot out my intentional perception. Reaching around inside that mass of foreign thought, I scanned its permeable boundary to the outside dream world. I began to understand the connections it relied on for visual processing. I found one submind, analogous perhaps to our visual cortex, and, narrowing my awareness there, I could tap into the representations it was forming, working out an interpretation through trial and error. Colors and contrast were handled geometrically, the sensory processing likely having evolved out of light receptors without differentiated cones, using some other mechanism or prism to categorize the light by wavelength, seeing the world in herringbone and crosshatch instead of red and blue. I sought to find another node of understanding. The minds conferred, knew they were being probed, rejected me and withdrew, or rather some guard was raised. I was presented with a cycle of minds, each changing in turn, camouflaging itself to be like the others. You were different. I formed words to attach to the sentiment of that interruption. The complexity of language, the encodings, something similar to that combination of words and grammar was at work there, modulating thought and emotion and impulse over whatever connection we shared in the dream world. What was the correct response? Empathy? Humility? Should I puff up like a creature attempting to demonstrate to a predator or rival that a physical engagement would cost them? It didn't matter, of course. What I was transmitting, what it could discern, would be whatever was happening in my own mind, through whatever decoding processes its minds possessed or could make use of, including this line of reasoning now as I could feel it all around me. Detaching from my own line of thought, thinking behind myself, I could feel some portion of it brushing against me with cautious appraisal. It was suspicious, trying to understand my capabilities, plotting its own contingencies. Whatever time lag was between our thoughts was the only possible shield I could hoist against it. What is this place? I focused my mind on that query as a fixed point, more so found myself doing than willing it. Through the fluid boundaries between me and the other, it was, like a piercing alarm one could not turn off. That direct focus of thought, all my conscious processes considering the character of the words, their sound, the semantic space they occupied, the thrust of my unconscious behind it. What is ode, the thought, or my interpretation acting on it? Stranger, intruder, guest? I could map those words to its confusion about how to consider me as it flowed between subminds. The other never seemed to produce direct lines of thought. Different aspects of it swirled about me, several problem chunks, meaning chunks scattered about. It has access to me, I thought, and I can only feel its surface parts and the raw emotion coordinating them. The sense of superiority in its reaction then was unmistakable. Directed or autonomic, I was not sure. I had confirmed some weakness, and in whatever territorial skirmish we had engaged, my own threat was lessened. I am not defenseless, I reminded myself, the creature. Different unconscious processes were rising up within me, again focusing on this place, dream world. It must not have had a simple decoding for dream. Nothing of the words seemed to occupy those processes inside it that were becoming more familiar to me by the moment. My own interfaces of thought were reshaping to track them, my unconscious still urging ahead, trying to gain some ground, some useful position from which to defend, strike if necessary, in this engagement. Place, I focused again. This place. A place like any other. Confusion at my own curiosity. A place you step out to when you step out in this direction. The information cohered slowly in a few places on the surface thoughts of the other that were now enveloping me. The step. That word was wrong. The other knew it, but it was trying to make sense of my locomotion, to grasp an appropriate metaphor. Its own motives in this shifted constantly. I would say I could hardly guess at them, but this would not be true. I could hardly guess at specific contents in its motivation, but the gist was as obvious as the nature of the game we were playing. The other was exploring, opening possibilities. In presenting a small offering here or there, it wanted to see what I would do, how I would react. It was learning me, learning our mental dance, learning what moves were on the table. Threat was the sentiment being projected at me, now as before. I had not come into the dream world so deliberately just to lose myself in such an engagement. The determination my own unconscious brought to bear was deciphering what it could. What was the step? A different axis of reality? There were dichotomies missing in its mind, frames of reference that did not cohere with my own. What did the creature misunderstand about my own misunderstanding? I was scanning it as it scanned me, trying to decode what I could. A naive dualism in my language. In dream, in mind, thinking that this was a place that minds go. This was some other axis of reality, and reality was information. Physics, the structure of the world that I experienced, that I lived and died by even. This was only one projection of that information in which my experience would otherwise be bound up. This place was made up of some other projection, an unseen sibling of the physical world. Information, the other ventured, focusing in multiple places as it had before to try to pass information to me, reverse engineering my own mapping of its concept with cautious curiosity. No physical, just information. A correction at what it thought was a mistake beyond children. It was struggling, as we would struggle in trying to explain language to an animal that could imitate our sounds, having been fooled momentarily by its parroting of speech. Why do we enter when dreaming? The information concept the creature had latched onto. What construct of information was compatible with this almost out-of-body coming and going? The other's regard persisted, deciphering my question, then another shift and disorientation. A listening part left and an answering part came before me. When it faces north, walking forward takes it north. To walk forward and go south, it must face south. To turn, it must use the turning part, not the walking part. Reaching for metaphors in my mind with which to communicate some obvious truth, something it would feel no need to communicate to others. I could feel the other's frustration, trying to explain and still trying to hold back what it thought it could while compelling a response, not wanting to give away anything beyond that. Maybe another angle would help me decipher the metaphor. From where in the waking world does this place emanate? Again, I focused the thought, this time fixing on one submind, not letting it slip past or revolve away. The response was almost pain-like. This was now a territorial engagement, had denigrated from diplomacy. Was I an aggressor here, simply in the act of thinking? Where does this place overlap? The confusion and processing on the surface, I focused my own thoughts again as one might shine an enormous industrial light into the depths of a cave. The other was parsing my question. It resisted a direct answer, but not with a unified front. The constituent minds were conferring as it tried to make sense of me. That sense-making betrayed it. Some part was distracted, tied up in this deciphering, and it let me pass unintentionally. The core? Does it ask about the core? I latched onto those pieces I caught in the chatter between minds, disentangling them, deciphering what I could. The core? The Vaskania Prime? Was the other or its kind there? Did they project this dream world through some technology I could not fathom? The core? No, it cannot have it. A sudden rush of panic coordinated all its surface processes as the other began to go dark and I was expelled. Then I felt it vanish from around me. I could not track where it had gone, was wondering if it had retreated. It had not. The other pushed through me from somewhere in my own mind. It had not left but gone inside, was now like a bomb going off in the direct center of my thinking. I was torn apart, my consciousness drawn and quartered, or more accurately, drawn into thousandths. I knew then what must have happened to the others, to Owen, what had spread him out in this place like some geological event. The push was an eruption, would have left veins of my mind scattered throughout this region of the dream world like so much volcanic rock, my consciousness torn apart and left as nothing more than a stratigraphy of thought. If not for the evil eye charm, the Nazar that the boy had handed me when I first arrived at Darklight City. The workings of that charm, or my unconscious in conjunction with it, whatever the source, I was gone, then ricocheting, swirling and cohering back into myself. Those moments of not-self from the push were at first chaotic and overwhelming, a flash of unordered perceptual events, all at once, then not at once, nonsensically arranged. The smell of flowers, then the sound of them being ground. My own ears and hearing apparatus were being ground into them, and yet the grinding became louder. A flash of light, my eyes fixed open, the retina burning, and I was unable to close my eyelids even a millimeter. The torturous, pleasant, absurd, all mixed up together. My own recall of this, though dulled now, still plays out like a small eternity, my mind assembling those sensations into a sequence. But I can infer the reality that this was all immediate, the result of being shattered and suddenly reformed. Because the other responded as if the push had done nothing, as if the eye of the Nazar had sprung into being in response, rendering its attacks ineffectual. We were still connected for a moment longer. I could feel the surprise and circulation inside of it. Pockets of dissatisfaction and frustration giving way to fear. It hadn't worked. I was still there, now encased in a sphere, concentric rings of dark then light blue, and that black pupil at the center, staring back into the other's shadowy form, assuming no affect at all, a dead, unregarding look. And then I was thinking my own thoughts, could begin to make out the faint, newly reformed ones of Owen and their disoriented youthfulness. The other was separated entirely, the blue-black eye surrounding Owen and I growing hard and opaque where it had been thin and translucent. As it solidified, the remaining echoes of the other's panic subsided. It pulsed around the few areas of the surface where light still pierced through, possibly regrouping or readying another attack. But while the eye had grown solid, Owen and I were fading in turn. Ego maintenance. I realized then that some portion of myself had been working on that problem, had enlisted my techniques and training from all those years on Oneiri Station, as the other's last thought, the core, echoed through my being. The other and its fear and aggression were gone, the I had vanished, and so I opened my own eyes and found myself yet again in the hospital, in the ward of the untethered dreamers. I was still grasping Owen's hand. I looked to his face to find him already looking back at me, tears starting on the inside of one eye, a channel forming between it and the bridge of his nose. I hugged him, grateful to have him back, but daring only a shallow sigh of relief. Chapter 6. The machines ran Owen through batteries of tests, verifying that it was him I had brought back, and not some information doppelganger of my own creation, or some agent of the other. I shared their concern for the latter when I discussed my encounter. To the extent that we could spy inside his brain, everything seemed to be in order. All they or I could do beyond that was wait and watch. I had been asleep, or at least in my doctored variant of it, for 16 hours. I felt an asymmetry of rest. My body ached with disuse, longed for movement, while my mind was still taxed and listless. I was tending to both by pacing in circles in the room where Owen was now being monitored. The movement seemed to settle both my physical and mental needs, freeing my brain to process the words being spoken. I don't understand. How has it been over 30 years? Just yesterday. Is this really me? Owen's disbelief, his voice quiet and higher pitched than matched his appearance, the effect of vocal fold atrophy from long disuse and aging. There were uneven breaks in the sound. The muscles that moved his tongue and his memories had not changed together. This was a teenager trying to produce speech as a 50-year-old man without having grown accustomed to small adjustments over the intervening time. I know, it's a lot to take in. I glanced at one machine's display, a sphygmomanometer from the numbers, tracking a steady small increase in blood pressure since Owen's return. No doubt one of the body's signs that it again possessed a concerned occupant. I turned to look out the window in his room, could see the dim light catching on waves flowing in that river by which we had grown up. I guess this is shock, Owen paused, obviously in thought. I don't even know how to begin feeling anything else. It's okay, Owen. It will take time. Time that I have less of, 30 years. I saw that with my own eyes in the mirror, can see it now, can feel my own skin sagging, aches here and there I know I never had before. He sighed. I know, I'm not showing much gratitude. I can't even process what you did yet or how you did it. That part isn't important, nor is any thanks. I just wish I'd felt ready sooner. I continued looking out the window, the river running its course in that half-light, the glimmer of the city occasionally casting an unnatural red or yellow on the water. I wasn't yet processing what I'd done either, just breathing, watching. Owen was nodding slowly. It hurts to talk. A pause. Please stay as long as you want, Viktor. I took him up on that as best I could, making us both tea, sitting with him for another hour. I walked to a respite room for the occasional hospital volunteers that the machines had reserved for me in order to go over my thoughts, to think about all that had transpired and what may next occur, what I could possibly hope to learn or do for the other untethered. From there I began to compose this account. I could not shake the feeling that I was guilty of something terrible, something that had brought the other to me. I had committed the most ancient of sins, hubris, thinking I could venture unharmed into the domain of the dying, to succeed where Gilgamesh and Orpheus had failed, or achieved at best partial victories. Would my own victory there turn out to be Pyrrhic? I could not say, I still cannot say. The core. The creature's concern had leaked through along with this secret. Creature, was that the right word for the other? I thought over its manifestation in the dream world. Maybe Vaskania's dream world was identical in some respects to our simulations. Perhaps this was all that the other's kind had remaining of their existence. Our own species certainly has imagined such an alternate reality, our bodies lying dormant and our minds active, or our own disembodied intellect being encoded in machine form, a transmigration of souls supplanting our own reality here in the physical realm with a virtual one. What could be at Vaskania Prime's core? Was core even the correct decoding of what the creature had thought? I had only pulled tiny pieces of understanding out of the other. If I was right and the creature had let slip, or rather, failed to hide from me, that something deep inside the planet was the source of the dream world, how could it have even come to be there? Was it the creature itself? Was its source biological, or some artifice, or a hybrid thereof? Had it predated the planet, the world built around the core through some unimaginably powerful technology? How could it withstand the heat and pressure? Vaskania Prime's core was fully opaque to us, its presence inferred, as with Earth's, merely from the planet's mass and seismic waves as the machine's instruments had been able to measure them. Its seismic activity was much less than Earth's, though it still possessed a weak magnetic field, much like the uninhabitable but similarly tidally locked planet Mercury near the sun of the Sol system. Its crust was thicker than Earth's, the outer mantle cooler, but further investigation still seemed out of reach. Eventually, if the machines attempted to drill down, they would contend with impenetrable heat and pressure. If there was conflict with the other, it would be a much smaller project to abandon this system and start over elsewhere. It was easier to venture further into deep space than inside one rocky planet. My thoughts turned to the other. Only I had experienced that being. Owen had no memory of it, but he had not been in a state for his brain to encode durable memories for some time. Was my experience of the other authentic? I thought about what possible arguments against this might be. It might have been the result of being overwhelmed, taking on simultaneous conscious and unconscious tasks as I had for so long. My cortisol levels were quite high. My adrenaline was far from having fully tapered. But I did not and do not think I would have manufactured such an experience. I cannot express in words what an alien feeling it was. I have explored many mind states in my training and wanderings in the dream world. Nothing ever felt like that. My language, my manner of phrasing, my experience, they might give rise to a belief that there are suitable human analogies of thought and feeling for having been enveloped by the other. Do not let that mislead you. Do not mistake my account, the best that I could craft in my limited time, for the experience that led me to author it. What had it tried to convey to me, or tried to keep from me, about our entry to the dream world? I can offer some half-interpretation. If I accept what the creature assumed and struggled to state, that there is no difference between information and physical reality, perhaps even that portion that we believe gives rise to consciousness, then to go about our waking lives, outside of the dream world or other realms that may be like it, is to be in some configuration of information that is subject to gimbal lock. Our minds may be embedded in a higher dimensional space, but limited by some constraint of our mental configuration from moving freely in each of those dimensions. Our modulation between waking and dreaming, this higher order neural shift of states, is like introducing a new axis of rotation, forcing previously parallel axes apart, allowing for new possibilities of orientation and motion. On Earth, there is no dream world. When moving through and feeling around in those new possibilities, whatever information entity we as conscious beings may be, there is nothing to find there. And so rather than recording memories of a coherent experience while sleeping, we get a mixture of random noise, the residue of alterations in motivation and priorities, marginally coherent story fitting, and the like. There is no dominant signal for our recall to recover. How had the other regarded me in those moments? With genuine fear, I think. Some part of my brain was still decoding that reflexive alien flow. Could I call it emotion? Even if my raw sensory input was mediated there, I felt the proximal part, that interface in my brain directly in front of my conscious experience. That portion still had to make sense of its inputs in a human way. It was difficult to separate that alien sense of being from my interpretation, but to some extent I must take the end result just as it was, as we must all do with our own thoughts and perception. How should I regard the other? The creature's concern aside, very little else had leaked through, about its motive, its goals, its relation to others. I didn't know if the other was utterly defenseless in the waking world, if it somehow had a body or weak part of itself in or near the core, or if it was bound up in the projection of the dream world. Could it summon an army, some armada from the stars, dispatch the machines and destroy our small settlement? Did it have the means to undermine the basic subsistence and water supply on which we depended? Or was it vulnerable? Was the planet's energeology different than the machine's models had predicted? If the dream world's source could be unmasked and disrupted, would that be the last of the other and maybe its kind? Its kind. I had wondered at first if it might have been solitary, like an intensely territorial creature that felt only animosity towards others of its species, who were all enemies or competitors. If it lived alone in the dream world, or the portion it staked as its claim there. But counter to this, in that mix of impressions in which I'd been awash, I'd gotten the distinct sense of shame. Again, it could have been my own interpretation, but other feelings had not mapped so cleanly onto human emotion. I was still working to make sense of them. And what creature feels shame if its stature or obligation to others of its kind doesn't matter to its own survival in some way? It also did not much care to be observed by me at all. Was it predator or prey? Both roles could confer that distaste in some sense. Both instincts had shaped humanity. We were given to sudden urges to run, to hide, and not be seen. But also we were an indisputable apex predator, hoping at times to catch our prey unaware, a careless destroyer of many other species. The earth, as we have all been taught, still bears the scars of having borne us. In that creature's mind there was fear. It had mastered what bravado it had to confront me there, to assume a superiority of being. And it was at home in the dream world, that much was not questionable. But I also knew I must be as alien to it as it was to me. Given that the dream world was its home, my facility there, hard-earned as it was, the threat it implied would be heavy. I had come there with a directness that deserved fear, like a shorebird diving into the ocean with ease, plucking out an unsuspecting fish. What reason would the bird have to envy the fish's gills? Why should a sea dweller look on any such transient with more than suspicion? Our conflicting ways of being, we humans and the other. I had to be careful not to lose perspective. How should I feel towards the creature? I accept that it, he, she, or we, is a conscious being. The things it felt and thought, even if artificial, I don't believe they could have been manufactured by something without a conscious mind. The dream world itself, for that matter. It could possibly be the creation of some material computation, but no blind guessing could lead to such a structured experience, alien as it was. The creature felt fear. For fear to have any bite, then pain, loss, and other such feelings would be within its experience as well. So it was capable of suffering. I felt an immediate obligation in this, to spare it such suffering if I could. I am not naive. I know not all creatures live socially in communities, feel kindness and concern for others, or even that their happiness is caught up in some way with other beings. But I am one such creature. These communities and obligations, they are so fragile among our own humankind. Many have left that road before. There, at the edge of chaos, is peaceful coexistence, because every equal being is a veiled threat. Each human to another, no matter how tight the relationship, is a knife on the neck. Behind many decision points are suicide, murder, mutual annihilation. My intent at recovering information, as threatened as I felt in the moment, could have been seen as a deeply transgressive act. I could find my own human metaphors that could justify such an interpretation. Even on Earth, where creatures had evolved near each other, the social signals of one animal could encode the opposite meaning for another, the wag of a dog's tail versus a cat's. Had I incited a war? That push. If I was correct about Owen, he or I might have triggered a fear response, but the other dreamers, the children, did they similarly imply any kind of threat? I was doubtful. They might have transgressed, possibly being curious in the other's presence could have been such a transgression. But it had shown that curiosity toward me as well. If the investigation of another's thoughts was an aggressive act, it felt no such compulsion to avoid that aggression. If we had offended, it was not an offense given by any set of mutual expectations. We could not consent to being thrust involuntarily into a world of another's making, to be asked questions but given no answers in return. Not as a community, not as a species. Whatever the other is, whatever threat is implied or opportunity there may be to make amends, we have to investigate, to learn all we can. And so I have laid down this account in a rush. My own experience, fragile thing that it is, I cannot leave it only in my mind. It may be the only evidence of an alien encounter we have come across on any world. For all I know, my mental record of that experience is one or more dreams away from certain destruction. I would hope for an understanding with the other or others, or excluding that, a longer stalemate. But I cannot mistake my hopes for rational expectations, nor will I seek to escape the dream world or force the subdued experience I might have on Oneiri Station and thereby see to my own safety. Because the other untethered are still here, all around me on their ward in this hospital. I am on the surface and will remain here. I will not abandon them. Owen was but one dreamer saved. Now I am at the end of being kept awake with chemical assistance, up against the edge of compromising my own clarity and alertness, and I dare not venture into the dream world again without them. When the time comes, I will fall asleep and enter that place, and that alien, and perhaps others of its kind, now knoweth me, and I know of them. Guess as I might, I don't know what will happen, but the time is near. Coda. This account is the final and only long-form work of Viktor Goto, the first renouncer of Oneiri Station. Over the next 2 months, Viktor journeyed back into the dream world each night, searching for more of the untethered. He left only a few notes from that time. These concerned the immediacy of his mission, comments on his mental states, possible tweaks to the chemicals the machines pumped into him, and their appropriateness for his strategies. Types of memories that worked better than others as anchors in rebuilding minds, the sounds, smells, and rhythms of the bodies of the untethered, and how they could provide clues for finding traces of the missing occupant. During that time, he returned 14 of those dreamers to their bodies. In that final rescue, his mind did not return to his body. It is not known if he encountered the other again or what became of him or it. No other dreamer has reported any encounter like the one he details in his account. Nor has anyone on Vaskania Prime become untethered since. My name is Elitza Hahn, and I was the last untethered that he saved. At that time, I was only a girl of 12. I have no memory of what scattered and dispersed my mind in the dream world, though I still feel the renouncer's work in me, holding in his own mind all the parts that comprised me, crafting me once again into a self, shaping me so that I would fit back into the vessel of my own body. I and several of the others he brought back saw to the return of his body to Oneiri Station after he failed to come back in the following years. There we became his fellow renouncers, sitting with him, tending his garden, and studying the detailed notes he took during his training, hoping to master his techniques or our own variations of them. Eventually, Viktor's body passed at the age of 61, having succumbed to the pancreatic cancer to which we now know all of his generation were susceptible. We have carried on our training in his absence, hoping one or more of us will soon be able to return to the surface of Vaskania Prime and continue his work.